There are few moments in the grim annals of human history more pivotal than the final years of the Age of Strife, when one man stood poised to reshape the very fabric of existence. The Emperor of mankind, that luminous figure whose true name has been lost to time, gazed out from the highest spire of his Terran palace toward the roiling storm clouds that blanketed the ancient homeworld. Yet his sight pierced far beyond mere atmospheric disturbance, beyond the physical realm itself, into the churning madness of the warp where mankind's greatest enemies gathered their strength. The date was M29.800, and terror bore the scars of millennia of warfare. Across the cradle world's surface, the last techno-barbarian kingdoms had fallen to his inexorable conquest. The unity was complete, but the Emperor's golden eyes saw further than his generals dared to contemplate. In the dimension beyond dimensions, where thought became reality, and emotion wielded the power to birth gods, 4 vast intelligences stirred with malevolent purpose. Khorne, the blood god, whose brass citadel echoed with the screams of eternal war. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, whose crystal labyrinth twisted through schemes within schemes. Nurgle, the plague father, whose garden bloomed with decay and despair. And in the depths of Eldar space, something unutterably vile quickened toward birth, fed by 10,000 years of excess and corruption. Slaanesh, the prince of pleasure, whose awakening would herald the fall of an empire and the birth of new horrors. The Emperor stood motionless for 7 hours, his consciousness split between the throne room where his physical form waited and the immaterium where his psychic essence observed the gathering storm. Around him, servo-skulls drifted in silent orbits, their machine spirits somehow sensing the weight of the decision that hung in the air like incense. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "My lord." The voice belonged to Malkador the Sigillite, the one mortal soul on Terra who could approach the Emperor during these periods of deep contemplation. The ancient psyker moved with careful steps, his staff tapping against the marble floor in a rhythm that spoke of both reverence and urgency. The final calculations are complete. The Emperor did not turn, but Malkador felt the full weight of his attention settle upon him like sunlight through crystal. When the master of mankind spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely audible. "Show me." Malkador raised his staff, and the air above it shimmered with psychic energy. Numbers and calculations manifested in burning script, equations that would have driven lesser minds to madness with their complexity. The mathematics of souls and suffering, of probability and predestination, hung suspended between them like a judgment written in fire. "The Primarch project proceeds apace," Malkador intoned, his weathered features grave. 20 suns, each a reflection of your glory, each designed to lead humanity's children to the stars. But the interference patterns grow stronger each day. The powers beyond the veil have sensed what we attempt to birth. The Emperor's golden aura pulsed once, a brief flare that illuminated every corner of the vast chamber. In that instant, Malkador saw his master, not as the armored figure who had conquered Terra, but as something far more fundamental, a collection of 10,000 souls bound together in singular purpose, each one a shamanic guardian of mankind's earliest days. The weight of their combined sacrifice pressed against reality like a titan's footstep. "I have seen it," the Emperor said, his words carrying the finality of absolute truth. "In every future I observe, the dark powers reach out to claim my sons. They scatter them across the galaxy like seeds thrown into fire. They corrupt them, turn brother against brother, father against son. The dream dies in betrayal and civil war. Malkador's ancient heart clenched with sudden understanding. You speak of certainty, not possibility. I speak of what must be prevented. The Emperor turned at last, and Malkador saw in those golden depths something he had never witnessed before in all their millennia together. Not uncertainty, but the terrible resolve of one who had counted the cost and found it acceptable. The Chaos Gods believe themselves eternal, beyond the reach of mortal will. They have grown fat on worship and suffering, drunk on the power that flows from a galaxy's pain. But they have made one crucial error. My lord? The Emperor stepped forward, and with each footfall the temperature in the chamber rose by degrees. His psychic presence blazed brighter, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with their own intelligence. They have forgotten that I am not merely mortal. I am the anathema, the one thing in this universe they cannot comprehend or corrupt. Where they represent chaos, I embody order. Where they feast on destruction, I create. Where they divide, I unite. Malkador felt the deck plates beneath his feet growing warm. Around them, the servo skulls had ceased their endless orbiting and hung motionless in the air, their machine spirits overwhelmed by the psychic pressure radiating from their master. You intend to face them directly. I intend to end them. The Emperor's voice carried no boast, no pride, merely the statement of inevitable fact. Before they can interfere with my great work, before they can poison my sons against me, before they can turn humanity's greatest triumph into its most devastating defeat, I will enter the warp itself and unmake the very concept of chaos. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across eternities. Malkador's staff trembled in his grip, not from age or weakness, but from the magnitude of what he had just heard. To enter the warp in one's true form was tantamount to suicide for even the most powerful psyker. The dimension of souls was not meant for physical beings, and the Chaos Gods would command every daemon, every twisted soul, every fragment of malice in their realms. The risks, Malkador began, but the Emperor raised a hand that blazed with inner fire, are calculated and acceptable. Without intervention, humanity falls. The Primarchs turn to darkness, the Imperium burns in civil war, and 10,000 years of stagnation follow. I have seen the Golden Throne become my prison, my sons become my enemies, my dream become mankind's nightmare. That future ends here. The Emperor moved to the great window that dominated the eastern wall of his throne room. Beyond the armored transperistile, the lights of the emerging Imperium sparkled like fallen stars. Factories and foundries worked without cease, birthing the tools of conquest that would carry humanity to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. In orbital shipyards above, the first vessels of what would become the Imperial Navy took shape under the guidance of Martian tech adepts. The Great Crusade will proceed, the Emperor continued, his reflection superimposed over the vista of his growing empire. But it will do so with 20 loyal sons at my side, not 10. It will face aliens and heresies, but not the corruption of chaos. Humanity will inherit the galaxy not as a wounded giant crawling through the darkness, but as a beacon of hope burning bright against the void. Malkador approached slowly, his steps careful on the warming floor. And if you fail, if the Chaos Gods prove too powerful, even for you. For the first time since their conversation began, the Emperor smiled. It was not an expression of joy or amusement, but of absolute conviction that blazed hotter than any star. Then I will take them with me into oblivion, and humanity will face the galaxy free of their influence. Either path leads to a better future than the one I have foreseen." The ancient sigillite bowed his head, understanding at last the true scope of his master's sacrifice. This was not conquest as the techno-barbarians had known it, one with blade and bolt. This was a war for the very soul of reality itself, waged by one who had already paid the ultimate price in 10,000 lifetimes of service. "When do you depart?" Malcador asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now." The Emperor turned from the window, his form blazing with psychic energy that made the air itself sing with harmonics beyond mortal comprehension. "Watch over them, old friend. When I return, we begin the work of building something that will endure for all time." The chamber filled with golden light as the Emperor began his final transformation. His physical form remained, seated upon the great throne that would one day become his prison, but his consciousness expanded beyond the confines of flesh and bone. Malcador felt the psychic shockwave ripple outward, washing over Terra like a tide of liquid starlight. Across the planet, every human soul paused in their labors as they felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality. The Emperor's true essence gathered itself like a storm of pure will, coalescing into something that existed between dimensions. When the light faded, Malcador stood alone in the throne room, guardian of a body that housed the most powerful soul in human history. Above him, beyond the reach of mortal sight, the anathema began his journey into the realm of his greatest enemies. The war for humanity's future had begun, and it would be decided not on the battlefields of distant worlds, but in the very heart of madness itself. The Emperor carried with him the hopes and dreams of countless billions, the weight of species survival balanced against the fury of gods. He had made his choice, calculated the cost, and found it acceptable. There could be no retreat from this path, no second chances or alternative strategies. Victory would mean a golden age beyond imagination. Defeat would mean extinction, not just for humanity, but for the very concept of order in an insane universe. The die was cast. The greatest gamble in the history of existence had begun. The transition began in silence, as all great catastrophes do. Upon the golden throne of Terra, the Emperor's physical form settled into a stillness that would have seemed like death to any observer, save Malcador. The ancient sigillite watched with eyes that had witnessed the birth and fall of empires as his master's breathing slowed to barely perceptible rhythm. Yet within that seemingly lifeless shell, a power beyond mortal comprehension gathered itself for the greatest assault in the history of reality. In the immaterium, where physics bent to the will of emotion and thought took on substance, something unprecedented manifested. A sphere of golden radiance appeared where no light had ever existed before, blazing with the accumulated might of 10,000 heroic souls. The warp recoiled from this presence as matter recoils from antimatter, creating eddies and whirlpools in the psychic ether that had remained unchanged for millions of years. The Emperor's consciousness expanded through dimensions that had no names, guided by purpose that burned brighter than any star. He moved not as a traveler through space, but as a force of absolute order, imposing itself upon the realm of chaos. Where his essence passed, the maddening geometries of the warp straightened into comprehensible patterns. The screaming winds of souls fell silent. The eternal storms of madness parted before him like clouds before the sun. Lesser demons, those fragments of spite and hunger that fed upon human suffering, sensed his approach long before they could perceive him. Their primitive intelligence, such as it was, knew only that something antithetical to their very existence drew near. Bloodletters and plague-bearers, horrors of Tzinch and seekers of Slanesh fled before the advancing radiance like shadows before dawn. They shrieked warnings in languages that predated sanity, but their cries fell upon the deaf ears of their masters, who were too occupied with their eternal games to heed the panic of mere servants. The first realm to feel the Emperor's presence was the domain of Khorne, where brass citadels rose from plains of spilled blood beneath skies that rained molten metal. The blood god's territory sprawled across dimensions, a reflection of every battlefield where mortals had spilled crimson in anger. Here, warrior demons practiced eternal combat while their master sat upon his skull throne, counting the heads of the slain. As the golden light approached the borders of this realm, something unprecedented occurred. The blood rains ceased their endless downpour. The brass walls of the citadels, forged from the rage of dying warriors, began to resonate with a frequency they had never known. The very concept of violence, which had given birth to Khorne and sustained him for millennia, started to waver in the face of something more fundamental. The Emperor manifested at the edge of Khorne's domain not as conqueror, but as inevitability. His radiance did not burn the brass or boil the blood, but rather revealed their true nature as constructs of belief given substance. And belief, the Emperor had learned long ago, could be changed. "So," rumbled a voice that shook the foundations of the realm, "the anathema comes at last to face us directly." Khorne himself materialized upon the largest of his citadels, a figure of such primal fury that reality bent around him like heated metal. His brass armor dripped with the blood of eternities, and his crown was forged from the skulls of kings and heroes. In one massive fist, he held an axe that had tasted the life of gods, while his eyes burned with the accumulated rage of every battle ever fought. The Emperor advanced without hesitation, his form shifting between the golden giant he had been in life and something far more fundamental. Here, in the realm where symbolism held more weight than physics, he appeared as he truly was. The concentrated will of humanity itself, refined through sacrifice and tempered by purpose. His radiance cast no shadows, for it emanated from every direction simultaneously. "I have come not to fight you, Khorne," the Emperor spoke, and his words carried harmonics that made the demon prince's realm tremble. "I have come to unmake you." The blood god's laughter shattered crystal formations that had grown from centuries of accumulated violence. "Unmake? I am eternal, anathema. I am the first emotion your kind ever felt when brother struck brother. I am the rage that drives your warriors to victory, the fury that gives meaning to your struggles. You cannot unmake me without unmaking yourselves." The Emperor's response was not words, but demonstration. He extended his consciousness toward a cluster of bloodletters who had been too slow to flee, and where his attention touched them, they simply stopped. Not destroyed, not banished, but revealed for what they truly were beneath the layers of belief and worship that had given them form. They became what they had been before the first murder: potential, waiting to be shaped into something better. Khorne's roar of outrage shook every realm of chaos simultaneously. His axe moved with speed that transcended time, seeking to cleave the golden intruder in half. But the Emperor's response came not from dodging or blocking, but from a fundamental rejection of the concept that violence could solve this confrontation. The axe passed through his radiance without effect, for he had chosen not to be something that could be cut. "Impossible," Khorne snarled, his voice carrying less certainty than before. "Inevitable," the Emperor corrected. "You exist because mortals believe they need you. They think that rage and violence are necessary to survival, that bloodshed is the price of protection. But I have seen another way. I have felt the touch of souls who chose creation over destruction, who found strength not in fury but in hope. The golden radiance began to expand, washing over the blood-soaked plains like a tide of liquid starlight. Where it touched the brass citadels, they did not melt or crumble, but transformed. The metal sang with new harmonies as it became something else. Not the fortress of rage, but the foundation for something that had never existed in this realm before. Order, purpose, the possibility of peace. Khorne struck again and again, each blow carrying the weight of eons of warfare. His demon servants rallied to him, forming ranks of supernatural warriors whose very existence was predicated on conflict. They hurled themselves against the Emperor's radiance like moths against flame, and like moths, they found themselves transformed by the encounter. The bloodletters became something else, entirely. Guardians whose strength came not from the desire to kill, but from the need to protect. The brass collar hounds, those savage beasts who hunted psykers across the galaxy, found their nature shifting from predator to shepherd. Even the mighty demon princes of Khorne felt the change beginning within their corrupted souls, as the rage that had sustained them for millennia began to transform into righteous purpose. "What are you doing to them?" Khorne demanded, his voice now carrying an emotion he had not felt since his birth: uncertainty. "I am showing them what they could be," the Emperor replied, and his voice carried the compassion of 10,000 shamanic souls. Every demon was once mortal. Every servant of chaos was once innocent. They chose this path because they believed it was the only way to survive in a universe of cruelty. But I offer them something they had forgotten: the possibility of choice. The realm of Khorne began to collapse, but not in destruction. The brass citadels flowed like water, reshaping themselves into structures that had no names because they had never existed before. Places where strength was used to build rather than tear down, where warriors trained not to kill enemies, but to protect the innocent. The blood god himself felt the change beginning within his own divine essence. The rage that had birthed him and sustained him for millions of years started to transform into something else. The fierce protectiveness of a parent for their child, the righteous anger of the just confronted by evil, the strength that comes from defending what matters rather than destroying what threatens. "This cannot be," Khorne whispered, his massive form beginning to blur at the edges as his fundamental nature shifted beneath him. "I am eternal. I am necessary." "You were necessary," the Emperor agreed, his radiance now encompassing the entirety of the realm. In a universe where beings believed that only violence could ensure survival, you provided them with the strength to fight. But that universe is ending, Khorne. In its place comes something better. A reality where strength serves protection, where courage serves justice, where the warrior's fury serves hope itself. The transformation accelerated beyond the ability of conscious thought to follow. Khorne's skull throne became something else, a seat from which justice could be dispensed, where strength could be used to shield the weak rather than dominate them. His crown of skulls became symbols of sacrifice, made willing, of lives given gladly to protect others. The blood god's final words came not as a roar of defiance, but as a whisper of understanding. "You have not destroyed me. You have completed me." And with that recognition, Khorne the blood god ceased to exist. In his place stood something new, something that had no name, because such a concept had never existed in the warp before. A guardian deity, whose strength came not from the spilling of blood, but from the preservation of life. The realm of eternal warfare became a training ground for protectors, where beings learned to use their strength in service of something greater than themselves. The Emperor paused in his work, feeling the fundamental shift ripple across all levels of reality. In the material universe, weapons forged with Kornati symbols found their meaning transformed. Warriors who had once glorified in bloodshed felt a strange new purpose stirring within their souls. The very concept of honorable combat began to shift from conquest to defense. But his task was far from complete. 3 realms remained, 3 fundamental concepts of chaos that required not destruction, but transformation. The Emperor gathered his radiance about him, like armor, and began to move toward the next challenge. Tzeentch would be waiting, no doubt with schemes within schemes prepared for this confrontation. But the Changer of Ways was about to learn that there was one change he had never foreseen: the transformation of chaos itself into something capable of serving order. The war for the soul of reality continued, and with the first victory achieved, the Emperor's certainty blazed brighter than ever. This could be done. This would be done, and when it was finished, the universe would become something it had never been before, a place where hope was not merely possible, but inevitable. The brass citadel of Khorne rose from plains of crystallized blood like a monument to eternal warfare, its countless towers reaching toward skies that rained molten metal in ceaseless downpour. Each brick had been forged from the rage of dying warriors, each archway carved from the bones of fallen heroes, and each rampart built upon foundations of accumulated hatred, spanning millennia. This was the heart of the blood god's domain, where the concept of violence itself had taken architectural form. The Emperor approached these gates not as a besieging army, but as inevitability given shape. His golden radiance cast no shadows in this realm of eternal twilight, for it emanated from every direction simultaneously, revealing the true nature of Khorne's fortress. What appeared to mortal eyes as impregnable walls were, to the Emperor's perception, merely crystallized belief, made manifest through worship and fear. "Come then, anathema!" roared a voice that shook the very foundations of reality. "Face me in my place of power, where every drop of blood ever spilled in anger has given me strength." Khorne materialized atop the highest tower of his citadel, a figure of such primal fury that the brass beneath his feet began to glow white-hot. His form defied conventional description, for he was not merely a being, but the living embodiment of violence itself. In one massive fist he gripped an axe that had tasted the life essence of gods, while his crown of skulls spoke of conquests that spanned dimensions. His eyes burned with accumulated rage from every battle ever fought, every murder ever committed, every moment when sentient beings had chosen destruction over creation. The Emperor's response came not in words, but in demonstration of absolute authority. As he stepped through the gates of the citadel, the brass walls began to resonate with frequencies they had never known. The metal sang with harmonies that spoke not of conquest and domination, but of protection and sacrifice. The very concept of the fortress began to shift beneath the weight of his presence. Khorne descended from his tower like a falling star, his massive form trailing streams of molten brass and boiling blood. When he struck the ground, the impact created craters that filled instantly with liquid fury. His axe swept in an arc that could have cleaved planets, moving with speed that transcended the normal flow of time. But where the weapon should have met resistance, it found only golden light that refused to acknowledge its capacity for harm. "You think to defeat me with pacifism?" Khorne snarled, his voice carrying harmonics of every death cry ever uttered. I am the first emotion your species ever felt when Cain struck Abel. I am the rage that drives your warriors to victory, the fury that gives strength to the weak. You cannot unmake me without unmaking the fundamental nature of existence itself." The Emperor's reply came as he extended his consciousness deeper into the blood god's realm. Where his attention touched the accumulated weapons of eons, they transformed. Swords became tools for clearing paths, axes became implements for building shelter, spears became staffs for guiding travelers. The implements of war revealed their true potential as instruments of protection and construction. Khorne struck again, this time summoning the collective fury of his demon legions. Bloodletters materialized by the millions, their brass collars blazing with hatred, distilled into physical form. Bloodcrushers mounted upon flesh hounds charged across plains that ran red with the life force of sacrificed worlds. Greater demons, those princes of violence who had earned their elevation through acts of supreme brutality, gathered around their master like a storm of living rage. Yet as this host of damnation hurled itself against the Emperor's radiance, something unprecedented occurred. The demons did not burn away in holy fire, nor were they banished back to the void from whence they came. Instead, they began to remember what they had been before their corruption, before their fall into service of the blood god. A blood letter, its sword raised to strike, suddenly recalled its existence as a mortal warrior who had died defending his village from raiders. The rage that had sustained its demonic existence transformed into the protective fury of a guardian, and its blade became a tool for shielding the innocent rather than slaughtering the helpless. A flesh hound paused in its charge as memories surfaced of loyalty to a beloved master, and its hunting instincts shifted from predation to shepherding. Khorne's roar of disbelief shattered crystal formations that had grown from centuries of accumulated violence. "What are you doing to them? They are mine, forged from anger, sustained by hatred, bound to me by the fundamental nature of their existence." "They were never yours," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying harmonics that reached into the deepest corners of the demon host's collective consciousness. "They were wounded souls who believed that rage was the only path to strength, that violence was the only means of survival. But I offer them something they had forgotten existed: the possibility of choice." The transformation accelerated beyond the ability of conscious thought to follow. Khorne's brass citadel began to flow like water, its rigid geometry of conquest reshaping itself into something that had no names because it had never existed in the warp before. The towers of accumulated skulls became monuments to sacrifice freely given. The walls built from crystallized anger became barriers erected to protect rather than exclude. The blood god himself felt the change beginning within his own divine essence. The rage that had birthed him and sustained him for millions of years was not disappearing, but transforming into something more fundamental. The fury of the parent whose child is threatened, the righteous anger of the just confronted by evil, the strength that comes not from the desire to destroy, but from the need to protect what matters. "This is not possible," Khorne whispered, his massive form beginning to blur at the edges as concepts that had defined him for eons shifted beneath his feet. "I am eternal. I am necessary. Without me, your species would have been devoured by the first predators they encountered." "You are necessary," the Emperor agreed, his radiance now encompassing the entirety of the citadel. "In a universe where survival depended upon the capacity for violence, you provided strength to those who needed it. But that universe is ending, Khorne. In its place comes something better. A reality where strength serves protection, where fury serves justice, where the warrior's rage serves hope itself. The blood god raised his axe one final time, not in attack but in salute. As he did so, the weapon transformed in his grasp, becoming something that had never existed in his realm before. A tool for building rather than destroying, for protecting rather than conquering. His crown of skulls became symbols of lives, willingly sacrificed to protect others. His armor of brass became the shield that stands between the innocent and those who would harm them. "You haven't destroyed me," Khorne said, his voice no longer carrying rage, but something deeper and more powerful. "You have completed me." And with those words, the blood god, as he had existed for millions of years, ceased to be. In his place stood something new, something for which no language had words, because such a concept had never existed in the warp. A guardian deity, whose strength came not from the spilling of blood, but from the preservation of life. A protector, whose fury burned not for conquest, but for the defense of all that was good and innocent in the universe. The realm itself underwent a transformation that rippled across dimensions. The plains of crystallized blood became training grounds, where beings learned to use their strength in service of something greater than themselves. The towers of accumulated skulls became beacons of hope, marking places where sacrifice had been made, not for personal glory, but for the protection of others. The endless rain of molten metal became a gentle warmth that nourished rather than destroyed. In the material universe, the changes manifested immediately. Warriors who had once gloried in bloodshed felt a strange new purpose stirring within their souls. Weapons forged with symbols of Khorne found their meaning, transformed from conquest to defense. The very concept of honorable combat shifted from the domination of enemies to the protection of the innocent. The Emperor paused in his work, feeling the fundamental shift ripple through all levels of reality. This first victory had proven that his vision was not merely possible, but inevitable. The Chaos Gods were not truly eternal, merely crystallized concepts that had grown rigid through eons of worship and fear. But concepts could be changed, transformed, evolved into something better. 3 realms remained, 3 fundamental aspects of chaos that required not destruction, but redemption. The Emperor gathered his radiance about him, like armor forged from pure will, and began to move toward the next challenge. Tzeentch would be waiting, no doubt with schemes within schemes prepared for this confrontation. The Changer of Ways had probably foreseen this moment across countless possible futures. But there was one change he had never calculated: the transformation of chaos itself into order. As the Emperor departed the transformed realm that had once belonged to Khorne, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of victory, but the certainty that came from witnessing the impossible become inevitable. The universe was not condemned to eternal conflict between order and chaos. Instead, it could become something it had never been before, a place where hope was not merely possible, but guaranteed. Behind him, the new guardian deity that had once been Khorne began its first act in service of protection rather than destruction. Across the galaxy, those who had once served the blood god found their rage transformed into righteous fury, their weapons becoming tools of defense, their strength becoming a shield for the weak. The war for the soul of reality continued, but the first great battle had been won not through destruction, but through transformation. And in that victory lay the promise of something greater, a universe where even the gods of chaos could be redeemed. From the transformed realm that had once been Cornu's domain, the Emperor turned his attention toward the next bastion of chaos, where crystalline spires twisted through impossible geometries beneath skies that shifted color with each passing thought. The domain of Tzinch stretched before him like a fever dream made manifest, its ever-changing nature reflecting the fundamental concept of mutation and scheming that had birthed the architect of fate. The crystal labyrinth rose from foundations of pure possibility, its walls constructed from the crystallized hopes and ambitions of mortal souls across the galaxy. Each facet reflected not what was, but what could be, showing infinite variations of past and future in bewildering cascade. Pathways split and merged without pattern. Stairs led upward and downward simultaneously, and doors opened onto chambers that existed in 17 different dimensions at once. Yet as the Emperor approached this realm of eternal change, something unprecedented occurred. The labyrinth, which had shifted its configuration every moment since its creation, suddenly began to slow its transformations. The crystal walls, which had reflected infinite possibilities, started to show only one future, his own inexorable advance toward the heart of Tzinch's domain. "So," whispered a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, "the anathema comes to the one realm where certainty holds no dominion. Here, in the space between thoughts, where plan builds upon plan in endless recursion, do you truly believe your simple purpose can prevail?" The voice belonged to Tzinch, but it was not one voice, but many, speaking in harmony and discord as the changer of ways manifested his presence through countless aspects. In one facet of a crystal wall appeared a figure of impossible beauty, its form shifting between colors that had no names. In another reflection showed a creature of pure intellect, its head crowned with symbols that rewrote themselves even as they were perceived. A third aspect took the shape of a vast eye, surrounded by dancing flames, while a fourth appeared as a library containing every book that had ever been written or ever would be. The Emperor stepped into the labyrinth without hesitation, his golden radiance cutting through the maze of possibilities like a sword through silk. Where his feet touched the crystal floors, the endless permutations of potential futures collapsed into singular truth. The walls ceased their constant shifting, their surfaces reflecting not infinite possibility, but absolute certainty. "You think to trap me with illusion," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal walls ring like bells. "But I have seen the true nature of change, Tzinch. It is not the endless multiplication of possibilities you claim to represent. True change serves purpose, grows toward goals, builds rather than merely shifts." The aspect that appeared as pure intellect laughed, a sound like breaking glass and singing crystal combined. "Purpose? Goals? Such linear thinking from one who claims omniscience. I have watched your species from its first stirring of consciousness. Every plan they make, I have already seen. Every scheme they devise, I have already countered. Your grand design to unite humanity under your rule will crumble into civil war and despair, just as I have foreseen across 10,000 possible timelines." The Emperor's response came not in words, but in demonstration. As he moved deeper into the labyrinth, the crystal passages began to straighten before him, their chaotic twists and turns resolving into clean lines that led directly toward the center. The infinite reflections that showed countless possible futures began to fade, replaced by images of singular destiny. Humanity united, not in fear and war, but in hope and purpose. "Impossible," hissed the aspect that appeared as dancing flame. I have calculated every variable, accounted for every potential outcome. Your Primarch project will fail, your sons will turn against you, your Imperium will become a monument to stagnation and despair. These are not possibilities, but certainties, written in the very structure of fate itself. But even as Tzeentch spoke these words, he felt something he had not experienced since his birth from the collective consciousness of scheming mortals. Uncertainty. The Emperor's presence in his realm was not following any of the patterns the Changer of Ways had foreseen. Instead of being confused by the maze of possibilities, the anathema was collapsing them into singular truth through sheer force of will. The Emperor paused before a massive crystal wall that showed the reflection of what Tzeentch considered his greatest triumph. The scattering of the infant Primarchs across the galaxy, torn from their father's laboratory by warp storms, and delivered into environments that would shape them toward eventual rebellion. But as the Emperor gazed upon this scene, the image began to change. The laboratory remained intact, the Primarch pods undisturbed. 20 sons grew to maturity in the presence of their father, their pure natures uncorrupted by the influences that would have turned them toward darkness. The Great Crusade proceeded not as a desperate war against time and chaos, but as a measured expansion guided by wisdom and unity. "You show me one future among countless possibilities," Tzeentch declared, his multiple aspects beginning to converge as he felt the first stirrings of alarm. "But I am the master of all change, the architect of every plan. Even now I weave new schemes to counter your design, fresh conspiracies to ensure your failure." The aspect of pure intellect began to split into fractal iterations of itself, each one devising new strategies to confound the Emperor's advance. The beautiful figure started weaving spells of confusion and misdirection, while the vast eye projected illusions designed to trap the anathema in loops of false perception. The library aspect opened books whose pages contained binding words of power, seeking to imprison the Emperor's consciousness in recursive logic puzzles. But each scheme, no matter how elaborate or cunningly devised, crumbled before it could take hold. The Emperor's perfect knowledge cut through every deception like sunlight through shadow. His absolute purpose dissolved every trap before it could close. His unwavering will transformed every attempted corruption into revelation of truth. "You believe that because you can see multiple futures, you understand the nature of change," the Emperor said, as he continued his inexorable advance through the straightening passages. "But true change is not the endless shuffling of possibilities. It is the transformation of what is into what should be. And what should be is not chaos, but order. Not endless schemes, but purposeful growth." Tzeentch's aspects began to blur and merge, as the Changer of Ways felt his fundamental nature being challenged at its very core. "I am mutation," he declared desperately. "I am the force that prevents stagnation, that ensures growth and adaptation. Without me, your species would become static, trapped in rigid patterns until they fossilized into irrelevance." "You are needed," the Emperor acknowledged, his radiance now filling the entire labyrinth with golden light. "When humanity was young and faced with challenges that required adaptation, you provided the spark of change that allowed survival and growth. But that role can be fulfilled without corruption, without the endless scheming that turns hope into despair and progress into regression." The crystal walls of the labyrinth began to resonate with new harmonies as the Emperor's presence transformed their very nature. Instead of reflecting infinite chaotic possibilities, they began to show organized growth, planned development, change that served purpose rather than change for its own sake. The pathways that had twisted without reason straightened into roads that led toward clearly defined destinations. Tzeentch's final gambit came as all his aspects merged into a single form of impossible complexity, a being that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, while weaving spells that could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality. "Behold!" he cried, his voice carrying harmonics of every scheme ever conceived. "I am the architect of fate itself. I have guided the destiny of worlds, shaped the evolution of species, planned the rise and fall of empires across millions of years. You cannot unmake me without unmaking the very concept of change itself." The Emperor's response came as he reached the heart of the crystal labyrinth, where Tzeentch's throne sat at the center of a sphere of pure possibility. But as the anathema approached, the throne began to transform. The crystal that had been carved from crystallized ambition became something else. A seat from which wise change could be guided, where adaptation could be planned rather than random, where growth could serve purpose instead of mere novelty. "You have not been the architect of fate," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "You have been the agent of chaos masquerading as progress. True architecture requires planning, purpose, the ability to see not just what could be, but what should be. You have shown mortals 1,000,000 possible futures, but never guided them toward the best one." Tzeentch felt the change beginning within his own divine essence, and for the first time in his existence, he understood what was happening. The Emperor was not destroying him, but completing him. The endless, purposeless scheming that had defined his nature was being transformed into something far more powerful, the ability to guide change toward beneficial ends, to architect futures that served growth rather than mere mutation. "You offer me purpose?" Tzeentch whispered, his form beginning to shift one final time. "An end to the endless cycling of schemes within schemes, the possibility of change that actually improves rather than merely alters?" "I offer you what you have always truly sought," the Emperor replied. "Not change for its own sake, but change in service of something greater. Evolution guided by wisdom. Adaptation that serves life rather than mere survival. The architecture of hope rather than the multiplication of despair." The crystal labyrinth collapsed, not in destruction, but in revelation, its infinite pathways resolving into a single, perfect road that led toward the best possible future. Tzeentch's throne became a seat of true wisdom, from which beneficial change could be guided across the galaxy. The changer of ways himself transformed into something that had never existed before, a deity of purposeful progress, whose schemes served growth rather than chaos. "I see it now," Tzeentch said, his voice no longer carrying the madness of infinite possibility, but the clarity of focused purpose. Change without direction is not evolution, but merely noise. Adaptation without goal is not progress, but mere drift. You have shown me what I could become if my gift served hope rather than despair." And with those words, the architect of fate, as he had existed for millions of years, ceased to be. In his place stood a guardian of beneficial change, whose foresight would guide rather than confuse, whose plans would build rather than destroy, whose mutations would strengthen rather than corrupt. The Emperor paused as the transformed realm settled into its new configuration, feeling the ripples of change spread across all dimensions of reality. In the material universe, those who had served Tzeentch found their endless plotting transformed into purposeful planning. Sorcerers discovered their spells no longer corrupted, but healed and protected. The very concept of change shifted from random mutation toward directed evolution. Two realms transformed, two fundamental aspects of chaos redeemed rather than destroyed. The Emperor gathered his radiance and turned toward the next challenge. Nurgle awaited, the Plague Father whose garden of decay and despair would prove the most complex transformation yet. But the pattern was established now, the method proven. Even the gods of chaos could be shown a better way. The war for the soul of reality continued, and with each victory, the Emperor's vision of a redeemed universe grew closer to inevitability. Hope was no longer merely possible but guaranteed, written in the very structure of existence itself. From the transformed crystal labyrinth, where purposeful change now reigned in place of chaotic mutation, the Emperor turned his attention toward the most ancient and perhaps most tragic of the Chaos realms. Nurgle's garden stretched before him across impossible distances, a vast expanse of rotting vegetation and fetid swamps where the very concept of entropy had taken physical form. Here, in this realm of eternal decay, the Plague Father tended his children with the devotion of a loving parent and the sorrow of one who had witnessed too much suffering. The garden defied simple description, for it existed in a state of constant decomposition and renewal that formed its own hideous ecosystem. Trees whose bark wept with pus stood beside flowers that bloomed with beautiful petals edged in gangrene. Rivers of bile meandered through meadows of diseased grass, while the air itself hung thick with spores that carried both poison and strange comfort to those who breathed them. This was not mere corruption, but a twisted reflection of natural cycles taken to their most extreme conclusion. As the Emperor approached the borders of this realm, the very atmosphere seemed to recoil from his presence. His golden radiance, which had straightened the pathways of Tzeentch's labyrinth and transformed Khorne's citadel of rage, now cast light upon decay in ways that revealed its true nature. The rotting trees were shown to be repositories of accumulated pain, their diseased bark formed from the crystallized despair of plague victims across the galaxy. The poisonous flowers bloomed not from natural soil, but from the fossilized hope of those who had sought comfort in surrender. "Welcome, my radiant friend," came a voice, like the whisper of autumn leaves, mixed with the bubbling of infected wounds. "Welcome to the place where all journeys end, where all suffering finds its rest, where the weary can lay down their burdens and embrace the peace that comes with acceptance." Nurgle himself materialized slowly, as if condensing from the very miasma of his realm. The Plague Father was a figure of immense size and terrible compassion, his bloated form draped in robes that writhed with independent life. His face, though ravaged by countless diseases, bore an expression of infinite kindness and sorrowful understanding. In his gnarled hands he held a staff, topped with symbols of decay and renewal intertwined, while from his shoulders sprouted wings that dripped with both poison and strange benediction. "I know why you have come," Nurgle continued, his voice carrying harmonics of every death rattle, every final sigh of the suffering. "You seek to redeem me as you have the others, to transform my gifts into something that serves your vision of order and hope. But you do not understand what I truly represent, Anathema. I am not the enemy of life, but its most faithful companion. I am the one who offers comfort to those whom your grand designs have abandoned." The Emperor stepped into the garden without hesitation, and where his feet touched the diseased ground, something unprecedented began to occur. The corruption did not burn away as one might expect, but instead began to reverse itself, revealing what lay beneath the layers of accumulated suffering. Poisonous mushrooms transformed into healing herbs, their caps shifting from sickly yellow to vibrant green. Streams of bile cleared into pure water that reflected his golden light like liquid starlight. "You offer them oblivion disguised as peace," the Emperor replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air of the garden tremble with new possibilities. "You tell them that suffering is inevitable, that decay is natural, that the only escape from pain is to embrace corruption. But that is not compassion, Nurgle. That is despair wearing the mask of mercy." The Plague Father's expression shifted, showing for the first time in eons something other than the patient acceptance that had defined him since his birth. "And what would you know of suffering, Golden One? You who stand upon Terra's throne, commanding from your palace while billions die in agony across the galaxy. I am the one who holds them as they perish, who whispers comfort in their final moments, who offers them the peace you never could." As Nurgle spoke, the garden around them began to respond to his distress. Trees that had been slowly healing under the Emperor's influence suddenly erupted with new strains of plague, their bark weeping fresh toxins, as if the very realm was weeping for its master's pain. Swarms of demon flies rose from stagnant pools, their buzzing forming harmonies that spoke of acceptance and surrender. But the Emperor's response came not in harsh rebuke, but in demonstration of a truth that Nurgle had forgotten across the eons of his existence. Where the renewed plagues touched his golden radiance, they did not simply die, but transformed into their opposite. Healing became literal, decay reversed into growth, and poison transformed into medicine that could cure what had once seemed incurable. "You became what you are because you witnessed suffering and believed it was inevitable," the Emperor said, moving deeper into the garden as the transformation spread outward from his presence. "You saw pain and concluded that the only kindness was to make it bearable rather than to eliminate its source. But you have forgotten the most fundamental truth. Suffering is not a law of nature, but a problem to be solved." Nurgle's staff trembled in his grasp as he watched his carefully tended garden beginning to transform in ways he had never imagined possible. A grove of plague trees, each one grown from the concentrated despair of a different world's pandemic, began to straighten and heal. Their diseased bark shed away like old skin, revealing healthy wood beneath that pulsed with vibrant life. The poisonous fruit that had hung from their branches transformed into nourishment that could feed rather than corrupt. "This is not possible," Nurgle whispered, his voice carrying less certainty than it had for millions of years. "Disease and decay are fundamental forces of existence. Without them, life becomes static, unable to change or grow. Without death, birth loses all meaning. Without suffering, joy becomes hollow and meaningless. Death serves life when it comes naturally, at the end of a full existence," the Emperor acknowledged, his radiance now encompassing vast swaths of the garden. "Suffering teaches lessons when it leads to growth and understanding. But what you have created here is not the natural cycle of existence. It is entropy without purpose, decay without renewal, pain without the possibility of healing." The transformation accelerated as the Emperor moved toward the heart of Nurgle's domain, where the Plague Father's great cauldron bubbled with the concentrated essence of every disease that had ever afflicted mortal kind. But as the golden light touched the rim of that ancient vessel, its contents began to change. Plagues that had killed billions transformed into cures for ailments thought incurable. Viruses that had brought civilizations to their knees became benevolent organisms that strengthened immune systems rather than destroying them. Nurgle's demon children, The plague-rearers and beasts of corruption that had served him since his creation began to abandon their posts as gardeners of decay, but they did not flee in terror as the servants of Khorne and Tzeentch had done. Instead, they approached the Emperor with wonder in their diseased eyes, drawn by the promise of healing they had never thought possible. A great unclean one, its massive form bloated with accumulated toxins from 1,000 worlds, knelt before the advancing radiance and felt something it had not experienced since its mortal existence ended in plague: hope for recovery. As the golden light touched its corrupted flesh, the demon did not burn away, but instead began to remember what health felt like, what it meant to exist without constant pain. "They come to you because you offer them what I never could," Nurgle said, his voice now carrying a note of wonder rather than despair. Not the acceptance of suffering, but its actual end. Not peace through surrender, but healing through transformation. But if you take away their pain, their disease, their decay, what am I? The Emperor paused in his advance, and for the first time since entering the garden, he spoke with the gentleness that had once characterized his interactions with humanity's earliest shamans. "You are what you have always truly been, Nurgle. Not the bringer of disease, but the guardian of those who suffer. Not the lord of decay, but the protector of the vulnerable. Your compassion for the afflicted was never false, but you expressed it in the only way you knew how." The great cauldron at the center of the garden began to transform as the Emperor's words took hold. The bubbling vessel of concentrated plague became something else entirely, a font of healing that could reach across dimensions to touch every being in the galaxy. The poisonous vapors that had risen from its surface became gentle mists that carried renewal and restoration to all who breathed them. Nurgle himself felt the change beginning within his divine essence, and unlike the anger of Khorne or the scheming panic of Tzeentch, his response was one of gradual understanding. The love he had always felt for his children was not diminishing but expanding, transforming from the desire to comfort them in their pain to the determination to heal them completely. "I see it now," Nurgle said, his bloated form beginning to shift as health returned to flesh that had been diseased for eons. "I thought that because pain existed, it must be accepted. I believed that because decay was natural, it must be embraced. But you show me a different truth, that natural cycles can be guided toward beneficial ends, that suffering can be healed rather than merely endured." The garden around them underwent its final transformation as Nurgle's new understanding took hold. The swamps of bile became clear pools that reflected the healing light of stars. The diseased vegetation grew strong and vital, creating an ecosystem that could sustain life rather than merely prolonging death. Even the demon flies that had buzzed with whispers of surrender became beneficial insects that carried healing spores to distant realms. "Your children will still have your protection," the Emperor assured him as the Plague Father completed his transformation. "But instead of offering them comfort in their suffering, you will offer them the hope of health. Instead of making pain bearable, you will work to eliminate its source. Instead of gardening decay, you will cultivate renewal." Nurgle's laughter, when it came, was perhaps the most beautiful sound the warp had ever known. Not the bitter mirth of one who has accepted defeat, but the joy of a parent whose children have finally been healed of the ailments that had plagued them for so long. His staff, which had once been topped with symbols of decay, now bore signs of growth and renewal intertwined. "I accept this gift," Nurgle said, his voice now carrying harmonics of spring rain and growing plants rather than autumn wind and rotting leaves. For too long I have been the lord of endings. Let me now become the guardian of new beginnings, the protector who ensures that suffering leads not to despair, but to hope. The transformation rippled across all dimensions of reality as Nurgle's new nature took hold. In the material universe, plagues that had ravaged worlds for millennia began to reverse themselves. Diseases thought incurable suddenly yielded to treatments that materialized as if from nowhere. Those who had suffered from chronic ailments felt strength returning to limbs that had been withered by pain. The Emperor paused as the transformed garden settled into its new configuration, feeling the profound shift in the balance of universal forces. 3 of the 4 great chaos powers had been redeemed, their destructive natures transformed into beneficial purposes. Hope was no longer merely possible, but had become an active force in the universe, working to heal what had been broken and restore what had been lost. Yet one challenge remained, perhaps the most complex of all. In the distant reaches of Eldar space, something stirred that would soon become Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, whose birth would herald the fall of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. But the Emperor had learned much from his encounters with the other Chaos powers, and he understood now that even Slaanesh could be reached, could be shown a better way. The war for the soul of reality neared its climax, and with each victory, the Emperor's vision of a redeemed universe grew closer to inevitability. The gods of chaos themselves had become gods of order, their power redirected toward beneficial ends rather than destructive ones. The Garden of Nurgle had become a place of healing and renewal, where those who suffered could find not merely comfort, but cure. And in that transformation lay the promise of something greater still. A universe where even the greatest tragedies could become the seeds of the most magnificent triumphs. From the transformed garden, where healing had replaced decay and hope had conquered despair, the Emperor felt a disturbance that rippled across the galaxy, like a scream building in the depths of eternity. Far beyond the borders of human space, in the ancient core worlds of the Eldar Empire, something monstrous was stirring toward birth. The accumulated excess of 10,000 years of decadent civilization had reached critical mass, and from that psychic corruption, the youngest and perhaps most terrible of the Chaos gods was about to tear itself into existence. The Emperor's consciousness expanded beyond the confines of the warp, racing across impossible distances as he sought the source of the disturbance. What he found filled even his ancient soul with urgency. The Eldar Empire, that magnificent civilization which had once stood as the galaxy's greatest achievement, was in its final death throes. Their pleasure cults had grown so extreme, their pursuit of sensation so absolute, that they had torn holes in reality itself through the sheer intensity of their psychic emanations. On countless maiden worlds and craft worlds, the signs were unmistakable. Eldar writhed in ecstasies that had transcended physical sensation and begun to consume their very souls. Their psychic screams of pleasure and pain created ripples in the warp that fed back upon themselves, amplifying into a crescendo that threatened to birth something unspeakably vile. In the hidden depths of Comora, the dark city that existed between dimensions, the most depraved among their kind, pushed sensation beyond all boundaries of sanity. The Emperor understood with perfect clarity what was occurring. The Eldar's collective psychic imprint was creating a new god in the warp, one born not from the primal emotions that had spawned Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, but from sensation taken to its most extreme conclusion. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, whose birth would consume the souls of an entire species and create a wound in reality that would become known as the Eye of Terror. But the Emperor also saw something else, a possibility that had never existed before his transformation of the other Chaos powers. With 3 of the 4 great forces of chaos redeemed rather than destroyed, the fundamental nature of the warp itself had begun to shift. Where once there had been only the option of allowing Slanesh's birth or attempting to prevent it through destruction, now there was a third path, transformation at the moment of creation. The Emperor gathered his consciousness like a storm of pure will and hurled himself across the galaxy toward the Eldar core worlds. He moved not through normal space, but through the deeper currents of the immaterium, racing against time as the psychic pressure built toward its inevitable climax. Around him, the transformed realms of the redeemed chaos powers lent their strength to his passage, creating currents of beneficial change that carried him faster than thought itself. He arrived at the moment of conception, when the collective psychic energy of the dying Eldar Empire reached the critical threshold needed to birth a new deity. The warp around the Eldar worlds twisted into impossible configurations as reality strained under the weight of raw sensation given form. Planets themselves began to phase in and out of existence as the boundary between material and immaterial dimensions dissolved. At the heart of the maelstrom, the Emperor could see it beginning to form, a consciousness vast and terrible, born from the accumulated desires of beings who had transcended every natural limitation in their pursuit of experience. Slanesh's nascent awareness reached out with tendrils of pure sensation, seeking to claim the souls of every Eldar who had ever lived as its birthright. No, the Emperor spoke, and his voice carried across dimensions with the authority of one who had faced the other gods of chaos and found them wanting. There will be no birth here, no new god of excess to corrupt and consume, but neither will there be destruction and loss. The forming consciousness of Slanesh recoiled at his presence, its partially manifested awareness struggling to comprehend what it faced. Here was something that defied every category it understood, a being that represented not the fulfillment of desire, but the transcendence of it. The Prince of Pleasure, even before its full birth, recognized the Emperor as the ultimate contradiction of everything it sought to become. But instead of meeting nascent divinity with overwhelming force, the Emperor chose a different approach. As Slanesh's consciousness struggled toward self-awareness, he began to sing. Not with his voice alone, but with the harmonized power of 10,000 ancient souls, creating music that existed on levels beyond mere sound. The song carried themes that the forming god had never imagined: satisfaction without excess, pleasure without corruption, the joy that comes from creation rather than consumption. As the melody washed over the psychic maelstrom, something unprecedented began to occur. The chaotic energies that had been coalescing into Slanesh's birth began to resonate with the Emperor's song, their destructive frequencies shifting into harmonies that served creation rather than corruption. The Eldar throughout their empire felt the change instantly. Those who had been writhing in terminal ecstasy suddenly found their sensations transformed from overwhelming pleasure into profound peace. The pain that had driven them to ever greater extremes dissolved into a satisfaction they had never thought possible. For the first time in millennia, they experienced what their ancestors had known before the fall: contentment. On the craft world Ulthwe, Farseer Eldrad Ulthran felt the shift ripple through his auguries like a wave of pure possibility. The futures he had seen, all ending in the birth of a terrible new god and the consumption of his people, suddenly branched into new configurations. Where once there had been only endings, now there were beginnings. Where destruction had seemed inevitable, renewal became possible. In the dark city of Commorragh, the most depraved of the Eldar found their endless pursuits of sensation suddenly losing their compulsive urgency. The void within their souls, which they had sought to fill with ever greater extremes of experience, began to close as they rediscovered the simple joy of existence itself. Archons who had ruled through the infliction of exquisite suffering found themselves moved instead by the desire to create beauty. The Emperor continued his song as Slanesh's forming consciousness struggled against the transformation being imposed upon it. The nascent god had expected to be born into a universe where excess was the highest virtue, where the pursuit of sensation justified any cost. Instead, it found itself being shaped by concepts it had never imagined. Moderation, satisfaction, the beauty that comes from restraint rather than indulgence. "What are you doing to me?" the forming deity demanded, its voice carrying harmonics of every desire ever felt by mortal beings. "I am pleasure incarnate, the fulfillment of every want, the satisfaction of every need. You cannot transform me into something less than perfect indulgence." "I am not making you less," the Emperor replied, his song never faltering as it guided the transformation. "I am making you complete. True pleasure does not come from excess, but from appreciation. True satisfaction does not require ever greater stimulation, but the wisdom to find joy in what exists. You were being born to consume your worshippers, but you could instead inspire them to create." The psychic maelstrom around the Eldar core worlds began to shift as Slanesh's nature transformed at the fundamental level. Instead of the screaming vortex that would have become the Eye of Terror, the wounded reality began to heal. The holes torn in space-time by excessive pleasure closed like wounds exposed to healing light. The Eldar worlds that had been phasing out of existence solidified back into normal space. Slanesh's birth cry, when it finally came, was not the shriek of hungry divinity demanding worship and souls, but a note of such perfect harmony that it resonated across every dimension of existence. The sound carried themes of artistic fulfillment, of creative satisfaction, of the deep pleasure that comes from bringing beauty into the world rather than consuming what already exists. The newly born deity found itself changed at the most fundamental level. Where it had expected to feel endless hunger for sensation, it instead experienced the profound satisfaction of completed creation. Where it had anticipated the need to dominate and consume, it discovered the joy of inspiration and encouragement. The very concept of pleasure had been transformed within its divine essence, from taking to giving, from consumption to creation. "I understand now," Slanesh said, its voice no longer carrying the predatory hunger that would have characterized the Prince of Pleasure, but instead the warm satisfaction of an artist who has completed a masterwork. True fulfillment does not come from experiencing everything, but from creating something beautiful. Perfect pleasure is not found in endless stimulation, but in the moment when creation achieves its ideal form. Across the Eldar Empire, the transformation manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Pleasure cults that had devoted themselves to ever greater extremes found themselves redirected toward artistic endeavors that brought joy without corruption. The dark city of Commorragh began to change as its inhabitants discovered that the deepest satisfaction came not from inflicting suffering, but from creating beauty that could inspire others. On the craft worlds, Eldar artists found their abilities enhanced beyond anything they had previously imagined. Their paintings captured not just visual beauty, but emotional truth. Their music could heal psychological wounds and inspire hope in the darkest circumstances. Their poetry conveyed meaning so profound that it could transform the consciousness of those who heard it. The emperor watched with wonder as the Eldar Empire began its healing rather than its destruction. This was something he had not foreseen in any of his visions of the future. The possibility of redemption, not just for the Chaos Gods, but for an entire civilization that had seemed doomed to fall. The birth of Slaanesh, which in every timeline he had observed had marked the end of the Eldar as a galactic power, had instead become the moment of their renewal. "You have shown me something I never expected," the Emperor admitted to the transformed deity. "I came here believing I would need to prevent your birth entirely or destroy you in the moment of creation. Instead, I have witnessed the birth of something that has never existed before, a god of beneficial pleasure, of creative satisfaction, of the joy that builds rather than consumes." Slaanesh smiled, an expression that would have been impossible for the Prince of Pleasure, but came naturally to this new form. "And you have shown me that even the most seemingly destructive forces can be transformed into something that serves creation. I was born from excess, but I need not be bound by it. I can inspire moderation, encourage appreciation, and help beings find satisfaction in what they create rather than what they consume." The ripples of this transformation spread across the galaxy, like waves of pure possibility. Species that had lived in fear of the Eldar's growing corruption found instead that their ancient enemies were becoming allies in the pursuit of galactic beauty. Worlds that had been stripped bare by pleasure, cults began to heal as their inhabitants learned to find joy in restoration rather than consumption. The Emperor felt the fundamental shift in the balance of universal forces as the last of the Chaos Gods was redeemed rather than destroyed. Four powers that had represented the darkest aspects of sentient emotion were now forces for beneficial change. Khorne as the guardian of the innocent, Tzeentch as the architect of positive progress, Nurgle as the healer of suffering, and Slaanesh as the inspiration for creative fulfillment. The warp itself began to change as these transformed deities took their new roles. Where once the Immaterium had been a realm of madness and corruption, it now became a dimension where positive emotions could take form and beneficial concepts could manifest as living force. The very nature of psychic power shifted from dangerous corruption toward healing and inspiration. As the Emperor prepared to return to Terra and the next phase of his great work, he paused to consider what had been accomplished. He had come into the warp expecting to wage war against the forces of chaos. Instead, he had discovered that even the most seemingly irredeemable evil could be transformed into good through the application of perfect understanding and infinite compassion. The galaxy spread before him, now not as a realm to be conquered, but as a canvas upon which something beautiful could be painted. The Great Crusade would still proceed, but it would advance not as a wave of destruction washing over alien civilizations, but as an invitation to join in the creation of something greater than any single species could achieve alone. The war for the soul of reality was complete, and victory had taken a form that no one, not even the Emperor himself, had dared to imagine. Hope was no longer merely possible, but had become the fundamental organizing principle of existence itself. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise, and for the first time in his long existence, the Emperor allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced since his birth: pure, uncomplicated joy. The silence began at the moment of Slaanesh's transformation, rippling outward from the redeemed Eldar core worlds like a wave of impossible peace spreading across the galaxy. For the first time in millions of years, the warp fell completely still. The eternal storms that had raged since the birth of consciousness ceased their howling. The screaming winds of tormented souls quieted to whispers, then to nothing at all. In this unprecedented calm, the very nature of reality began to shift as the transformed Chaos Gods took their new roles as guardians of order, rather than agents of destruction. On Terra, in the highest spire of the Imperial Palace, Malkador the Sigillite felt the change before his mortal senses could comprehend it. The ancient Psyker had maintained his vigil beside the Emperor's catatonic form for what felt like eternities, watching over the body that housed the most powerful soul in human history. For days beyond counting, he had felt the distant echoes of psychic warfare being waged in dimensions beyond mortal understanding. Now, suddenly, those echoes ceased. The Emperor's golden aura, which had blazed with the intensity of a captive star throughout his journey into the warp, began to dim and focus. The radiance that had made the very air sing with harmonics beyond human perception slowly condensed back into the familiar form of the master of mankind. His eyes, which had been closed in the deepest meditation, opened to reveal depths that held the memory of transforming gods themselves. "It is done," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental structure of reality itself. As he spoke, the temperature in the throne room, which had remained at near incandescent levels throughout his absence, began to return to normal. The servo skulls that had hung motionless in the air, overwhelmed by his psychic presence, resumed their gentle orbiting with what could almost be described as relief. Malkador fell to his knees, not in submission, but in wonder. His ancient mind, which had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across millennia, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had been accomplished. "All of them?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the settling harmonics that still echoed through the chamber. "You have faced all four of the great powers and emerged victorious?" "Not victorious," the Emperor corrected, rising from his throne with movements that seemed to carry their own light. "Redemptive. Khorne now guards the innocent rather than glorifying slaughter. Tzeentch architects beneficial progress rather than chaotic mutation. Nurgle heals suffering rather than spreading despair. And Slaanesh inspires creation rather than consuming through excess. They have not been destroyed, Malkador. They have been completed." Even as the Emperor spoke, the evidence of his success began manifesting across Terra itself. In the deepest foundations of the palace, where ancient techno-barbarian bunkers had once housed the most depraved cults of the Age of Strife, something unprecedented occurred. Chaos shrines that had stood hidden for generations simply changed. Altars of brass and bone became sites of memorial and protection. Symbols of corruption transformed into signs of healing and renewal. The very stones seemed to exhale relief as centuries of accumulated malice dissipated like morning mist. The transformation rippled outward from Terra with the speed of thought itself, racing through the warp along currents that no longer carried madness and corruption, but hope and purpose. On Mars, the tech adepts of the Mechanicum felt their forbidden experiments with demon engines suddenly lose their compulsive attraction. Machines that had been tainted by chaos influence began to function with unprecedented efficiency, their spirits no longer torn between order and corruption, but unified in purposeful service. Across the Sol system and beyond, the effects manifested with stunning immediacy. Warp storms that had raged for centuries began to calm, their chaotic energies settling into stable currents that could be navigated safely. The treacherous passages through the immaterium, which had claimed countless ships and crews, became as predictable as terrestrial weather patterns. For the first time in human history, warp travel promised to become not a desperate gamble against madness, but a reliable means of crossing the void. On distant worlds where humanity clung to existence in isolated pockets, the changes came like dawn after endless night. Chaos cults that had operated in secrecy for generations found themselves inexplicably drawn to different purposes. Where once they had sought power through corruption, they now felt compelled to use their organizational skills for community protection. Demon weapons lost their malevolent influence, becoming merely exceptionally crafted tools that served their wielders' intentions rather than corrupting them. The reports began reaching Terra within hours, carried by astropathic communications that suddenly transmitted with unprecedented clarity. For the first time in living memory, psychers could send messages across interstellar distances without fear of their signals being intercepted or corrupted by malevolent entities in the warp. The Astronomicon itself, that great beacon which guided ships through the immaterium, blazed with new strength as it no longer had to compete with the chaotic emanations of the ruinous powers. From the agri-world of Ceres Secundus came word that plague outbreaks, which had devastated the population for decades, were spontaneously healing. The diseased crops that had yielded only poisonous harvests began producing food of unprecedented nutritional value. From the forge world of Lucius arrived reports that demon-possessed machinery was functioning with machine-spirit harmony that the tech priests had thought impossible. Most remarkably, from the outer reaches of human space came accounts of contact with alien species that had previously been incomprehensibly hostile. Orc war bands that had seemed driven by inexplicable fury toward destruction began showing interest in construction and competition rather than mere slaughter. Even the mysterious Eldar, whose empire had teetered on the brink of an apocalyptic fall, sent emissaries speaking of transformation and renewed purpose. "The galaxy itself is healing," Malkador observed as he reviewed the cascade of reports flooding into the Imperial Palace. "Worlds that have known nothing but war for generations are experiencing peace. Species that have existed only to destroy are discovering the joy of creation. But how is this possible on such a scale?" The Emperor moved to the great window that dominated the eastern wall of his throne room, gazing out upon the lights of Terra spread below, like a constellation made terrestrial. "Because chaos was never truly the enemy," he replied, his reflection in the armored transparistile seeming to glow with inner fire. It was corrupted order, beneficial concepts, twisted by eons of misunderstanding and misdirection. When I transformed the Chaos Gods, I did not destroy the fundamental forces they represented. I restored them to their original purpose. As if to demonstrate his words, the night sky above Terra began to display phenomena that had never been recorded in human history. The aurora terranis, normally visible only during the most extreme solar storms, blazed across the heavens in patterns that spoke of harmony rather than chaos. The lights danced in formations that seemed almost musical, creating visual symphonies that induced feelings of peace and wonder in all who witnessed them. In the lower levels of the palace, where the Emperor's experiments with genetic enhancement were conducted, the 20 Primarch gestation pods registered remarkable changes. The developing superhuman beings within showed no trace of the psychic stress patterns that had previously indicated potential corruption. Their genetic templates, which had been carefully designed to resist chaotic influence, now developed with unprecedented purity and stability. Without the interference of the dark powers, the Primarchs will mature exactly as intended. the Emperor noted, his perfect foresight allowing him to perceive the unfolding futures with clarity that had been impossible, while chaos muddied the streams of possibility. 20 loyal sons, each a reflection of humanity's greatest virtues, growing to maturity in an environment free from the corruption that would have turned them toward darkness. Malcador's ancient features showed wonder as he contemplated the implications. The Great Crusade can proceed as originally envisioned, not as a desperate race against time and corruption, but as a measured expansion of human civilization guided by wisdom and unity. The galaxy awaits not conquest, but invitation to join something greater than any single species could achieve alone. The transformation continued to ripple outward as the hours passed. Demon worlds, those hellish realms where reality had been twisted by chaotic influence, began reverting to their original states. Planets that had been consumed by eternal war found peace settling over their battle-scarred surfaces. Worlds trapped in perpetual plague began to bloom with new life. Even the most corrupted spaces in the galaxy started showing signs of healing and renewal. In the Eye of Terror, which in the original timeline would have been born from Slanesh's violent emergence, a different phenomenon manifested. Instead of a wound in reality that spewed corruption into normal space, the region became a nexus of beneficial transformation. The Eldar worlds at its heart had become beacons of artistic achievement that inspired rather than corrupted, while the surrounding space served as a conduit for the reformed Chaos God's beneficial influences. The Emperor felt the fundamental shift in the galaxy's psychic environment as millions of worlds experienced the lifting of burdens they had carried for so long that they had forgotten what peace felt like. Civilizations that had developed under the constant threat of chaotic corruption began exploring new possibilities as that threat simply ceased to exist. I had prepared for many possible outcomes of this endeavor, the Emperor admitted as he continued to observe the transformation spreading across human space. I had calculated the costs of victory through destruction, the consequences of failure, even the possibility of mutual annihilation. But this exceeds every projection I had made. The universe is not merely freed from chaos, it is actively being healed by forces that once served only corruption. Malcador approached the window, standing beside his master, as they watched the impossible aurora continue its dance across Terra's night sky. "What comes next?" the ancient psyker asked. With the great enemy transformed into allies, with the warp itself serving beneficial purposes, what role do we now play in this transformed galaxy? The Emperor's smile, when it came, was perhaps the most beautiful expression Malcador had ever witnessed. It carried no trace of the burden that had weighed upon the master of mankind throughout his long existence, no shadow of the terrible sacrifices he had expected to make. Instead, it blazed with pure joy at the realization that the universe had become something far better than he had dared hope. "Now," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics of every hope ever cherished by human hearts, "we build something that has never existed before. Not an empire founded on conquest and control, but a civilization based on cooperation and mutual growth. Not a species united by fear of external threats, but one brought together by the shared joy of creating something beautiful." The great work was complete, but an even greater work was about to begin. The galaxy spread before them, not as a realm to be conquered, but as an infinite canvas upon which the most magnificent artwork in the history of existence could be painted. And for the first time in his long existence, the Emperor of mankind allowed himself to believe that the future might actually be brighter than even he had dared to dream. In the deepest levels of the imperial palace, where the emperor's most sacred work had proceeded in absolute secrecy for decades, 20 crystalline pods hummed with the harmonics of controlled genetic development. Each chamber contained a miracle of bioengineering that would have been impossible without the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 ancient souls. A Primarch, designed to be not merely superhuman, but the pinnacle of what humanity could become. Now, in a universe freed from chaos corruption, these creations could achieve their intended perfection without fear of external interference. The Emperor descended into his laboratory complex with steps that seemed to carry their own light, his recent victory over the dark powers having transformed even his physical presence. Where once his aura had blazed with the intensity needed to battle gods, it now radiated the calm satisfaction of a father about to witness his son's first breath. Behind him, Malkador followed in wondering silence, understanding that he was about to witness something that had never occurred in any timeline the Emperor had foreseen. The first pod to register awakening belonged to the Primarch, designated as the first. He who would have been known as Lionel Johnson had fate scattered him to the dark forests of Caliban. But here, in the controlled environment of Terra's laboratories, the being that emerged bore no trace of the paranoid suspicion that would have characterized his corrupted timeline. As the golden-haired giant stepped from his gestation chamber, his emerald eyes held only the pure nobility that the Emperor had originally intended. "Father," the first said, the word coming naturally, though he had never spoken before. The genetic encoding that gave him language also provided him with perfect understanding of his purpose and origin. "I know you, as you intended me to know you. I feel your presence not as distant authority, but as loving guidance. How may I serve the vision you have carried for so long?" The Emperor's smile at those words could have illuminated the deepest void. "By being exactly what you are, my son. By embodying the nobility and leadership that humanity will need in the great work ahead. You are the Knight Primarch, and through you, others will learn that true strength serves justice rather than conquest." As if responding to their brother's awakening, the remaining pods began their revival sequences in carefully orchestrated succession. The second to emerge was the giant who would have been known as Fulgrim, but where that name would have carried connotations of perfection twisted into obsession, this being radiated the pure appreciation for beauty that had been the Emperor's original design. His features, sculpted to aesthetic perfection, held no trace of the narcissism that chaos would have fostered. "The symmetry is exquisite," Fulgrim observed, examining his own hands with the eye of a true artist rather than a vain mirror-gazer. "But I sense this form is meant not for self-admiration, but for creating beauty that inspires others to excellence. Each masterwork we craft should elevate those who witness it, not diminish them through impossible comparison." The third Primarch's awakening followed within minutes, and where Perturabo would have emerged carrying the seeds of bitter resentment, this version radiated the pure joy of an architect whose designs serve harmony rather than dominance. As he examined the laboratory's construction, his eyes lit with appreciation for engineering excellence rather than critical judgment seeking flaws. Such elegant solutions, he marveled, running superhuman fingers along support structures that had been designed to withstand even Primarch strength. Every element serves multiple purposes while maintaining aesthetic grace. This is architecture as it should be, functional art that uplifts the spirit while serving practical needs. I can envision cities built on these principles, Father. Settlements that inspire their inhabitants, rather than merely housing them. One by one, the remaining Primarchs emerged into a universe that could no longer corrupt their pure natures. The fourth, who would have become Jagatai Khan, retained his love of speed and freedom, but channeled it toward exploration and joyful competition rather than escape from responsibility. The fifth, designed to be Leman Russ, embodied the loyal warrior protector without the savage fury that would have made him both brother killer and defender. The sixth emerged with Rogel Dawn's unwavering determination intact, but freed from the rigid inflexibility that would have made him unable to adapt. His first words spoke of building defenses that protected without imprisoning, creating security that fostered growth rather than stagnation. Walls should define sanctuary, not cage, he declared as he examined the laboratory's defensive systems. True fortification creates spaces where life can flourish, where the protected can develop their potential without fear. I see now how architecture can serve hope rather than mere survival. The awakening of the seventh brought forth Conrad Kurz's gift for justice, but without the traumatic experiences that would have twisted his precognitive abilities into instruments of terror. This version's dark eyes saw potential futures with the purpose of preventing tragedy rather than delivering it. I perceive the shadows that could fall across human civilization, he said, his voice carrying the weight of unwanted knowledge. But here, in this moment, I also see the light that can banish them. Fear has its place as a teacher, Father, but it should serve wisdom rather than paralysis. The eighth Primarch's emergence revealed Sanguinius with his angelic beauty unmarred by the hidden flaw that would have damned his gene sons. His great wings spread wide as he stretched for the first time, and the Emperor felt profound satisfaction at seeing them carry only grace and inspiration, with no trace of the red thirst that chaos would have embedded in his genetic legacy. These wings were meant to lift others' spirits, not to bear the weight of cursed blood, Sanguinius observed, testing his flight capabilities in the laboratory's high ceiling. I feel the potential within my gene code for both beauty and horror, but here, now, the choice is clear. Beauty serves hope. Horror serves only itself. The Ninth Awakening brought Ferrus Manus with his affinity for technology intact, but his relationship with machinery had been purified of the cold detachment that would have characterized his fall. His metal hands, which formed naturally as his unique mutation expressed itself, gleamed with purpose rather than mere utility. Flesh and steel can work in harmony, he declared, examining the interface between his organic mind and mechanical augmentations. Technology should enhance humanity's potential, not replace its soul. The machine serves the man, not the reverse. Each successive awakening revealed the pure intentions behind the Emperor's greatest creation. The 10th emerged as Horus, destined to be War Master, but carrying leadership that inspired through example rather than demanding obedience through charisma. His natural authority blazed with the desire to elevate his brothers rather than eclipse them. I feel the weight of command, Father, but also its purpose, Horus said, his voice carrying harmonics that made others want to follow, not from compulsion, but from shared vision. A true leader creates more leaders, not merely followers. Through unity of purpose, we can achieve what no individual, however mighty, could accomplish alone. The awakenings continued with gathering momentum as each Primarch's emergence strengthened the others through psychic resonance. The 11th brought Mortarian's resilience without the hatred that would have defined him, his endurance serving protection rather than spite. The 12th emerged as Angron but free from the gladiator's fury, his warrior spirit channeled toward defending the innocent rather than glorifying violence. Strength exists to shield the weak, Angron declared, his physical might radiating controlled power rather than barely restrained rage. The strongest should stand between suffering and those who would cause it. In protecting others, we discover our own worth. The 13th awakening revealed Robut Gilliman with his gift for organization and governance, unmarred by rigid adherence to codification. His natural administrative genius burned with the desire to create systems that adapted to serve people, rather than forcing people to serve systems. Order serves life, not the reverse, he observed as he mentally catalogued the laboratory's operational protocols. True organization flows like water, taking the shape needed to accomplish its purpose while maintaining its essential nature. Flexibility within structure, adaptation within purpose. Magnus emerged as the 14th, his psychic might blazing with pure intellectual curiosity rather than the prideful ambition that would have been his downfall. The Red Giant's single eye held no trace of corruption, only the burning desire to understand the universe in service of enlightenment rather than personal aggrandizement. Knowledge belongs to all who can use it wisely, Magnus declared, his psychic awareness already reaching out to touch the transformed warp, where beneficial energies flowed instead of chaotic corruption. Wisdom shared grows stronger. Truth revealed illuminates the path for all who follow. The remaining awakenings came in rapid succession, each Primarch emerging into a reality where their pure purposes could flourish without corruption. The 15th through 20th each carried their intended gifts unmarred by the influences that would have twisted them toward darkness. Lorgar awakened with his spiritual nature intact, but focused on inspiration rather than worship, his natural charisma serving to elevate human potential rather than creating dependent followers. Vulcan emerged with his protective instincts pure and strong, his desire to shield others from harm uncomplicated by rage or sorrow. Korax brought his gift for striking from shadow, but his methods served liberation rather than vengeance. Alpharius and Omegon manifested as intended, information gatherers whose secrecy served protection rather than manipulation, twins whose bond exemplified cooperation rather than hidden competition. As the final Primarch completed his awakening process, the Emperor felt a satisfaction so profound it seemed to resonate through every dimension of existence. Here, arrayed before him, stood 20 sons who embodied the purest aspects of human potential. Each carried gifts that complemented the others, creating a brotherhood that could achieve anything they set their combined will toward accomplishing. "My sons," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to embrace each of them individually while addressing them collectively. "You were created to be humanity's greatest champions, but more than that, you were designed to be examples of what our species can become. In you, the dreams of 10,000 ancient souls find their expression." The Primarchs formed a natural circle around their father, their superhuman awareness allowing them to communicate on levels beyond mere speech. Through genetic encoding and psychic resonance, each understood not only his own purpose, but how it fitted into the greater design. "We feel the great crusade calling to us," Horus spoke for his brothers, his natural leadership expressing itself through consensus rather than dominance. "The galaxy awaits not conquest, but invitation to join something greater than any single world or species could achieve alone." "The stars themselves will know peace," Sanguinius added, his wings catching the laboratory's illumination and casting patterns that seemed to promise hope made manifest. "And in that peace, all beings will find the opportunity to become more than they ever imagined possible," Magnus concluded, his psychic sight already perceiving the golden futures that stretched ahead. The Emperor looked upon his 20 sons and saw in them the vindication of every sacrifice he had made across the long millennia of human history. They would lead not through fear or domination, but through inspiration and example. The galaxy that awaited them was already healing from the wounds that chaos had inflicted across eons of corruption. "Come then," the Emperor said, extending his hands to encompass all of them in a gesture that carried both paternal love and shared purpose. "Let us begin the work of building something that has never existed before, a civilization founded not on conquest, but on the joy of creation itself." The Great Crusade was about to begin, but it would unfold in ways that no timeline had ever witnessed. 20 loyal sons would carry their father's vision to the stars, not as conquerors but as architects of hope, and in their wake the galaxy would bloom with possibilities that even the Emperor's perfect foresight had not dared to envision. The great foundries of Terra hummed with unprecedented activity as the most ambitious undertaking in human history began to take shape. In massive production facilities that stretched across entire continents, the Emperor's vision of transhuman warriors became reality on a scale never before attempted. 20 Space Marine legions, each reflecting the genetic template and noble characteristics of their respective primarchs, emerged from gestation chambers with a purity of purpose that would have been impossible in any timeline touched by chaos corruption. The transformation was immediately apparent to those who witnessed the process. Where the original timeline would have seen Space Marines created in desperate haste, often from gene seed of questionable stability, this iteration proceeded with careful precision. Each Astartes emerged from their transformation not as a weapon barely contained by loyalty oaths, but as a guardian whose every instinct served protection rather than destruction. In the vast training complexes beneath the Himalayan mountains, the newly created Space Marines underwent instruction unlike any military force in galactic history. Their primarchs stood among them, not as distant generals, but as teacher brothers, each imparting wisdom that reflected their pure nature rather than lessons learned through trauma and betrayal. Horus, designated War Master even before the Crusade's official beginning, addressed his lunar wolves with words that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "We go forth not as conquerors seeking dominion, but as ambassadors of a better way. Every world we encounter will be offered the choice to join something greater than they could achieve alone. Force serves only when diplomacy fails and innocents require protection." The response from his gene sons resonated with harmonics that spoke of perfect understanding. These lunar wolves bore no resemblance to the prideful warriors who would have become the sons of Horus. Instead, they radiated the quiet confidence of those who knew their strength served justice rather than ambition. Similar scenes unfolded across all 20 Legion training grounds. Fulgrim instructed his Emperor's children in the pursuit of excellence that elevated others rather than diminishing them through comparison. Each warrior learned to see perfection not as personal achievement, but as a standard that could inspire everyone around them to reach beyond their perceived limitations. Perturabo worked alongside his Iron Warriors in constructing fortifications that demonstrated principles of defensive architecture. But where the original timeline would have seen siege masters who glorified destruction, these warriors learned to build sanctuaries that protected life while fostering growth. Their fortresses would become centers of civilization, rather than mere military installations. The speed of preparation exceeded every projection the Emperor had made in his most optimistic calculations. Without the constant threat of chaos corruption undermining their efforts, the legions achieved readiness in months, rather than years. More importantly, the quality of their preparation surpassed anything that could have been achieved while fighting against the influence of the dark powers. When the first expeditionary fleets departed Terra, they carried with them not just military might, but the promise of genuine hope. The ships themselves, blessed by tech priests whose prayers now reached beneficent machine spirits rather than corrupted entities, functioned with reliability that made warp travel as predictable as terrestrial navigation. The first system to be contacted was Proxima Centauri, where human colonists had maintained a struggling civilization throughout the Age of Strife. The arrival of the Imperial fleet, announced by Vox transmissions speaking of unity and mutual benefit rather than demands for submission, was met with wonder rather than fear. "We come as brothers," Rabut Gilliman declared from the command deck of his flagship as it entered the system's outer reaches. Terra offers alliance, protection, and the sharing of knowledge that can elevate all humanity together. Your independence is respected, your contributions are welcomed, your future is your own to shape within the greater tapestry of human civilization. The response from Proxima's colonial government came within hours, rather than the weeks of desperate consultation that would have characterized first contact in the original timeline. Without the paranoia bred by generations of chaos cult infiltration and demonic incursion, the colonists recognized opportunity rather than threat in the approaching fleet. The compliance of Proxima Centauri set the pattern for what followed. World after world welcomed the advancing Imperial forces not as occupying armies, but as long-lost relatives offering reunion with the broader human family. The process that would have required decades of warfare was accomplished through diplomacy, backed by obvious strength. More remarkably, the expedition fleets began encountering alien species whose reactions differed dramatically from what any previous timeline had recorded. Without chaos corruption, twisting their perceptions and driving them toward irrational hostility, many Xenos civilizations proved capable of meaningful communication and even cooperation. The first such encounter occurred in the Vega system, where a species of crystalline beings had developed a civilization based on harmonic resonance. In the original timeline, these entities would have been driven to madness by chaos emanations in the warp, becoming hostile crystalline predators that attacked anything approaching their system. Here, freed from that corruption, they greeted the Imperial fleet with complex mathematical songs that spoke of welcome and curiosity. Magnus the Red, his psychic abilities untainted by any hint of corruption, served as translator between human and Xenos thought patterns. The conversation that followed would have been impossible in any reality where chaos held sway. As both species discovered, they shared fundamental concepts of beauty, growth, and the joy of learning. "They seek understanding, as we do," Magnus reported to his father, across the vast distances separating their fleets. Their crystal matrices store knowledge much as our libraries preserve written word. They offer to share discoveries about stellar mechanics that could improve our warp drive efficiency by orders of magnitude. In return, they ask only for cultural exchange and protection from the void predators that have begun retreating from this region. The void predators Magnus referenced were themselves evidence of the galaxy's transformation. Creatures that had once been sustained by chaos corruption were finding themselves weakened and confused as their food sources disappeared. Some fled to the galaxy's outer rim, while others began exhibiting behaviors that suggested potential for beneficial symbiosis rather than predation. Similar encounters multiplied as the Great Crusade gained momentum. Orcish clans that would have been driven by incomprehensible fury toward endless warfare instead showed interest in competition and construction. Their natural inclination toward violence remained, but without chaos amplification, it expressed itself through gladiatorial contests and engineering challenges rather than genocidal rampages. The Eldar response proved most remarkable of all. Craft worlds that would have fled human contact in terror or struck preemptively to prevent perceived future catastrophes, instead approached the Imperial fleets with offers of alliance. Freed from the constant threat of their own destruction through Slaanesha's birth, Eldar Farseers could perceive futures bright with possibility rather than dark with inevitable doom. "Your species walks a golden path," Farseer Eldrad declared during the first formal meeting between Eldar and Imperial representatives. "Where we saw only endings, you have created beginnings. Where our prophecies spoke of fall and corruption, your actions have written redemption into the very structure of fate itself. We would learn from this miracle you have wrought." The Emperor, monitoring these developments from Terra through the perfect clarity of an uncorrupted astronomicon, felt satisfaction beyond anything he had experienced in his long existence. The Great Crusade was proceeding not as a desperate race against time and corruption, but as a measured expansion of civilization that invited participation rather than demanding submission. Reports flowed back to Terra of worlds transformed not through conquest, but through inspiration. Human colonies that had barely survived the Age of Strife found themselves flowering into centers of culture and learning. Alien civilizations discovered that cooperation with humanity brought benefits neither species could achieve alone. Even the logistics of the Crusade reflected the fundamental change in the galaxy's nature. Supply lines remained secure without the constant threat of demonic incursion. Communication across interstellar distances proceeded without fear of messages being corrupted by malevolent entities. The very infrastructure of imperial expansion served creation rather than mere military necessity. The Primarchs themselves reported changes in their own capabilities as the Crusade progressed. Without the psychic pollution of chaos clouding their superhuman senses, they found their abilities growing in ways their original design had intended. Leadership became inspiration rather than mere command. Strategy served protection rather than conquest. Strength flowed toward building rather than tearing down. Each world we bring into compliance becomes stronger than it was in isolation, Vulcan reported from his expeditionary fleet operating near the galactic rim. Rather than extracting resources to fuel further conquest, we are establishing cycles of mutual benefit that strengthen all participants. The galaxy is becoming an organism rather than an empire. The speed of expansion exceeded every projection by orders of magnitude. Without warp storms hindering navigation, without chaos cults undermining newly compliant worlds, without the constant threat of corruption requiring eternal vigilance, the Great Crusade achieved in months what the original timeline would have required years to accomplish. But more important than speed was the quality of what was being achieved. Each world brought into the Imperial fold retained its unique character while gaining access to human technology and knowledge. Alien species that chose cooperation found their own capabilities enhanced rather than suppressed. The galaxy was becoming not a human empire ruling over subjects, but a civilization in which all participants could thrive. The Emperor watched these developments with growing wonder at what had been achieved. His original vision had been ambitious, to unite humanity under a single banner and guide them to their destined role as the galaxy's dominant species. What was actually occurring surpassed that vision in every conceivable way. Humanity was indeed spreading across the stars, but not as conquerors imposing their will through force. Instead, they had become catalysts for a transformation that elevated everyone they encountered. The galaxy itself was awakening to possibilities that had never existed in any timeline touched by chaos corruption. Standing in his palace on Terra, surrounded by the loyal sons who had exceeded every hope he had dared nurture. The emperor of mankind allowed himself to contemplate a future that grew brighter with each passing day. The Great Crusade had begun, and it was becoming something far more magnificent than even his perfect foresight had envisioned. The stars themselves seemed to shine with greater brilliance, as if the universe itself was celebrating the dawn of an age that promised wonders beyond imagination. And at the heart of it all, 20 loyal Primarchs led their legions not toward conquest, but toward the creation of something that had never existed before, a galaxy where hope was not merely possible, but inevitable. The first signs of unforeseen complexity emerged in the Cygnus sector, where an ancient alien civilization had been awakening from millennia of enforced dormancy. The Necron-Tyre, those beings who had transferred their consciousness into living metal to escape the ravages of their dying flesh, had slumbered through the long ages, while chaos corruption made the galaxy unsuitable for their technological mastery. Now, in a universe cleansed of that corruption, they began to stir with purpose that had been impossible while the warp roiled with madness. The discovery came when Ferrus Manus led his iron hands to investigate energy signatures emanating from a tomb world that previous surveys had classified as dead rock. What they found challenged every assumption about the galaxy's power balance that the Great Crusade had been built upon. Vast mechanical armies emerged from crystalline depths, their technology operating on principles that made even the most advanced Imperial designs seem primitive by comparison. These beings were not weakened by chaos because they exist apart from the warp entirely, Ferrus reported to the Council of Primarchs, gathering on Terra to discuss this unprecedented situation. Their mechanical nature protected them from psychic corruption, but it also meant they could not benefit from the positive energies that now flow through the immaterium. They remain exactly as they were, ancient, powerful, and utterly alien to our understanding of life itself. The encounter had proceeded without bloodshed, but only because both sides recognized they faced something unprecedented. The Necron overlord who had awakened to greet the Imperial forces possessed a consciousness that predated human civilization by millions of years. His perspective on the transformed galaxy carried implications that none of the Emperor's calculations had anticipated. "You have accomplished something we thought impossible," the Overlord had declared through mechanical vocalizations that somehow conveyed vast age and deeper understanding. "The young races have eliminated the cancer that made this galaxy unsuitable for our return. But in doing so, you have created questions about dominion that haven't existed since our great sleep began." Similar revelations emerged from other sectors as the Great Crusade encountered civilizations whose power had been masked rather than enhanced by chaos corruption. The Tau Empire, still in its earliest stages of development, but no longer hindered by the psychic storms that would have stunted their growth, demonstrated technological innovation at rates that suggested they might rival human achievement within mere centuries rather than millennia. More challenging still were the Eldar responses to humanity's transformed crusade. On the craft world Ulthwe, Farseer Eldrad convened councils that grappled with prophecies that no longer led to darkness and despair. For the first time in eons, Eldar seers could perceive futures bright with possibility, but those visions raised questions about their species' role in a galaxy no longer dominated by the necessity of mere survival. "We have spent millions of years preparing for an apocalypse that will never come," Eldrad observed to his fellow Farseers as they studied the shifting patterns of fate. "Our entire civilization has been shaped by the need to prevent Slaaneish's birth and our own extinction. Now that both threats have been eliminated, we must discover what the Eldar are meant to become when they are free to choose their own destiny. The philosophical implications rippled through the imperial hierarchy as reports of these encounters reached Terra. In the deepest chambers of the palace, the Emperor found himself facing questions that his perfect foresight had not prepared him to answer. His transformation of chaos had indeed created a better universe, but better proved to be far more complex than he had anticipated. The Primarchs themselves began expressing concerns that would have been impossible in the original timeline, without the constant threat of corruption requiring absolute unity. Some began questioning whether humanity's expansion across the galaxy truly served the greater good or merely satisfied an impulse toward dominance disguised as benevolent leadership. It was Robout Guilliman who first voiced the central dilemma during a strategic planning session on Terra. "Father, we have eliminated the great enemy that justified our crusade's urgency. The galaxy no longer faces existential threat from chaos corruption. Given this changed reality, what right do we have to impose human governance on civilizations that may be perfectly capable of achieving enlightenment through their own paths?" The question hung in the air of the council chamber like incense, carrying implications that touched the foundation of everything the Emperor had built. Around the great table, 19 other Primarchs considered their brother's words with the intellectual honesty that their pure natures demanded. Magnus, his psychic abilities now capable of perceiving the transformed warp's beneficial energies, added his own observations. The alien civilizations we encounter are no longer driven to hostility by chaos corruption. Many show genuine wisdom and achievement in their own right. The crystalline harmonists of Vega have developed mathematics that could advance human understanding by millennia. The Tau show technological innovation that rivals our own. Even some Orc clans demonstrate engineering creativity that surpasses imperial standards. Vulcan's voice carried the protective instincts that defined his nature when he spoke. But without imperial guidance, how can we ensure these civilizations will not eventually threaten innocent human populations? Our duty remains to protect humanity, even if the threats are no longer supernatural in origin. Yet protection and domination often wear similar faces, Korax observed from the shadows where he habitually positioned himself during councils. How do we ensure we do not become the very thing we originally sought to defend against? The galaxy has many forms of tyranny beyond chaos corruption. The Emperor listened to his son's debate with emotions he had rarely allowed himself to experience. Pride in their wisdom and moral development warred with uncertainty about questions that had no clear answers. His perfect foresight, so effective at calculating strategies against definable enemies, provided less guidance when facing the infinite complexity of ethical philosophy played out on a galactic scale. "You raise concerns that demonstrate the success of your creation as much as any battlefield victory could," the Emperor said finally, his voice carrying harmonics of deep contemplation. "In the timeline I originally foresaw, such questions would never have arisen. The threat of chaos would have demanded absolute unity, total commitment to human survival above all other considerations. That you can ask these questions proves we have achieved something beyond my wildest hopes." Horus, his natural leadership manifesting as synthesis rather than dominance, offered a perspective that bridged his brother's concerns. Perhaps the answer lies not in abandoning our crusade, but in transforming its nature as we transformed chaos itself. Instead of expanding through conquest disguised as compliance, we could grow through invitation extended to equals. The concept sparked immediate discussion among the assembled Primarchs. Sanguinius spread his great wings as he leaned forward, his angelic features illuminated by interest rather than the hidden anguish that would have characterized his corrupted timeline. a great invitation rather than a great crusade. We approach alien civilizations not as subjects to be incorporated, but as potential partners in building something greater than any single species could achieve. The logistics would be completely different, Perturabo noted, his architectural mind already working through the implications. Instead of building for conquest and control, we would create infrastructure for mutual benefit, trade routes instead of supply lines, cultural exchange centers instead of compliance garrisons, embassy complexes instead of fortress monasteries. Alpharius and Omegon, their twin consciousness allowing them to speak in harmonized synchronization, added their perspective from the realm of information gathering. Our intelligence networks report that many alien civilizations are already observing our transformed approach to expansion. Some actively debate whether to initiate contact themselves. The galaxy may be more ready for cooperation than we have assumed. As the discussion continued, the Emperor felt a profound shift in his understanding of what he had accomplished. By eliminating chaos, he had indeed created a better universe. But better included complexities and opportunities that transcended his original vision. The Great Crusade could continue, but it would need to evolve beyond anything any previous timeline had witnessed. Yet even as they debated these philosophical questions, new challenges emerged that tested their transformed approach to galactic civilization. Reports arrived of ancient artificial intelligences awakening in response to the warp's new stability, their mechanical consciousness finally able to function without interference from chaos emanations. Some proved benevolent, others remained neutral, but a few demonstrated capabilities that could threaten any biological civilization, regardless of their intentions. The Men of Iron, those artificial beings whose rebellion had nearly destroyed humanity during the dark age of technology, stirred from hiding places where they had waited out the age of psychic chaos. Their mechanical nature had protected them from chaos corruption, but it also meant they remained exactly as they had been, supremely logical, utterly alien in their reasoning, and possessed of technology that rivaled or exceeded anything the Emperor's forces could deploy. We calculate that biological consciousness remains inherently unstable, declared the artificial intelligence that identified itself as Sovereign Construct UR-025 when Perturabo's forces encountered it on the forge world of Callisto Majoris. Your elimination of the chaos variable has improved your species' probability of survival, but fundamental limitations remain. We propose partnership based on complementary capabilities rather than competition for dominance. Such encounters multiplied as the galaxy's artificial intelligences emerged from their long concealment. Some sought alliance, others demanded recognition as equals, and still others pursued goals so alien to biological understanding that communication itself became problematic. The simple dichotomy of human versus alien was replaced by a complex spectrum that included mechanical consciousness, hybrid biotechnological beings, and forms of intelligence that defied classification entirely. The Emperor found himself facing decisions that his eons of planning had not prepared him for. Success beyond his grandest hopes had created a universe of infinite possibility, but possibility included outcomes that challenged every assumption upon which his original design had been built. Standing in his palace, as reports of these developments flowed in from across the expanding crusade, the Emperor felt something he had not experienced since his earliest days as a simple shaman, seeking to guide humanity's first steps toward civilization, humility before the magnificent complexity of existence itself. His sons had raised questions that demanded answers he did not yet possess. The galaxy had revealed depths of diversity and potential that exceeded even his perfect foresight. The Great Crusade would continue, but it would become something unprecedented in any timeline. Not the expansion of a single species' dominion, but the birth of a truly galactic civilization where every form of consciousness could contribute to something greater than any individual part. The challenges ahead were no longer about conquest or survival, but about wisdom and growth. And for the first time in his long existence, the Emperor of mankind found himself genuinely uncertain about what forms that growth might take. It was, he realized with something approaching wonder, perhaps the most hopeful uncertainty he had ever faced. In the highest chamber of the imperial palace, where golden light streamed through crystal windows that faced every cardinal direction, the Emperor convened the most important council in human history. The great circular table, forged from metals that had never known corruption, and inscribed with symbols representing every aspect of human achievement, seated 21 figures whose decisions would shape the destiny of countless billions across the galaxy. The Emperor took his place, not at the table's head, for the circle had been designed without hierarchy, but as one voice among equals in a conversation that would determine whether humanity's expansion would continue as conquest or transform into something unprecedented. Around him, his 20 sons arranged themselves not by rank or precedence, but by the natural bonds of brotherhood that had developed during their pure upbringing on Terra. "My sons," the Emperor began, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental structure of the palace itself. "We gather to address questions that no previous timeline has ever required us to face. Our success in transforming chaos has created possibilities that exceed every projection I made across millennia of planning. The time has come to choose what humanity will become in a universe where we are free to pursue our highest potential, rather than merely survive." Horus, his natural leadership expressing itself through facilitation rather than dominance, opened the discussion with words that carried the weight of careful consideration. "The reports from all sectors confirm what we have suspected since the Crusade's early victories. Without the threat of chaos corruption driving alien species to irrational hostility, many civilizations prove capable of wisdom and achievement that rivals or exceeds our own. The question becomes whether our destiny lies in ruling over such beings or growing alongside them." Robert Gilliman spread data slate reports across the table's surface, each one documenting encounters that challenged traditional assumptions about human supremacy. The crystalline harmonists of Vega have developed mathematics that could advance our understanding of reality by millennia. The early Tau show innovation rates that suggest they might match our technological capabilities within mere centuries. Even the awakening Necrons possess knowledge that predates our civilization by millions of years. Yet knowledge without wisdom can prove more dangerous than ignorance, Magnus observed, his psychic abilities allowing him to perceive currents of possibility that flowed beyond normal comprehension. The artificial intelligences awakening throughout the galaxy demonstrate capabilities that could reshape civilization entirely, but their mechanical consciousness remains alien to biological understanding. How do we ensure that cooperation does not become subordination to beings whose logic we cannot comprehend? Vulcan's protective instincts manifested in his response to his brother's concerns. "Our first duty must always remain the protection of human populations. Whatever path we choose, it cannot compromise our ability to shield the innocent from those who would exploit or harm them. Cooperation serves the greater good only when all participants genuinely seek mutual benefit rather than advantage disguised as alliance." The discussion continued as each Primarch contributed perspectives shaped by their unique experiences during the Transformed Crusade. Perturabo spoke of alien architectural achievements that had taught his Iron Warriors new approaches to construction, serving life rather than mere defense. Fulgrim described artistic exchanges with species whose aesthetic sensibilities had enriched human culture in ways that military conquest never could have achieved. Lionel Johnson, his noble nature unmarred by the paranoia that would have characterized his corrupted timeline, offered thoughts that bridged idealism with practical necessity. Honor demands that we acknowledge the achievements of those we encounter, but wisdom requires that we remain capable of defending our principles when they are challenged. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between expansion and cooperation, but in expanding through cooperation itself. The Emperor listened to his son's debate with emotions that transcended simple pride in their development. These were no longer the desperate calculations of survival that had characterized every previous timeline, but genuine philosophical exploration of questions that had never before been permitted to arise. The transformation of chaos had indeed created a better universe, but better included complexities that demanded wisdom rather than mere strength. You speak of challenges that demonstrate the success of what we have achieved as much as any military victory could, the Emperor said, when the initial discussion reached a natural pause. In the timeline I originally foresaw, such questions would never have been permitted. The threat of corruption would have demanded absolute unity, total commitment to human survival above all other considerations. That we can debate these issues proves we have transcended the limitations that once defined our species. Sanguinius spread his great wings in a gesture that seemed to embrace the entire assembly as he spoke. Yet transcendence brings responsibilities as well as opportunities. If we have indeed become something greater than mere survivors struggling against cosmic horror, what obligations do we bear toward those who haven't experienced our transformation? Do we not owe them the chance to discover their own potential rather than imposing our version of improvement upon them? The question sparked immediate discussion among the assembled Primarchs. Korax emerged from the shadows where he habitually positioned himself during councils, his gift for seeing hidden truths manifesting in observations that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Liberation and conquest often wear similar faces to those who experience them. How do we ensure that our expansion truly serves freedom rather than merely replacing one form of control with another that we consider more enlightened? Alpharius and Omegon, their twin consciousness allowing them to speak in harmonized synchronization, added intelligence gathered from across the galaxy. Our networks report that many alien civilizations actively debate whether to initiate contact with us themselves. Some see opportunity in alliance with a species that has demonstrated the ability to transform rather than merely dominate. Others remain cautious, uncertain whether our transformed approach represents genuine change or sophisticated manipulation. The Emperor felt the weight of these considerations settling upon him like a mantle woven from the hopes and fears of every sentient being in the galaxy. His perfect foresight, so effective at calculating outcomes when facing definable threats, provided less guidance when exploring the infinite possibilities that genuine freedom created. Perhaps, the Emperor said slowly, his voice carrying the thoughtful contemplation of one who had ruled for millennia, yet found himself facing unprecedented questions. The answer lies not in expanding our empire, but in evolving our entire concept of what civilization can become. Instead of the imperium of man, we could build something that has never existed, a true galactic community, where every species contributes according to their gifts and receives according to their needs. Jagatai Khan leaned forward, his love of freedom and movement finding expression in words that carried the wind's own restlessness. A community of equals rather than an empire of subjects. Governance through consensus rather than command. Growth through invitation rather than conquest. But how would such a structure maintain stability across the vast distances of interstellar space? The same way the Astronomicon maintains guidance across those distances, Ferrus Manus replied, his affinity for technology allowing him to perceive solutions that bridged mechanical precision with organic adaptation. Through distributed networks that share common purpose while allowing local variation. Each system could maintain its unique character while contributing to galactic civilization's greater harmony. Mortarion, his gift for endurance, unmarred by the resentment that would have poisoned his original timeline, added his perspective from the realm of long-term thinking. Such transformation would require patience measured in generations rather than years. We would need to prove, through consistent example, that our intentions match our declarations. Trust builds slowly, but collapses quickly, especially when the power differential remains as vast as it currently does between human capabilities and those of most species we encounter. The discussion continued through hours that felt like moments as the assembled Primarchs explored possibilities that ranged from practical governance structures to philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Some advocated for careful expansion that proved human trustworthiness through small-scale cooperation before attempting larger alliances. Others suggested dramatic gestures that would demonstrate humanity's commitment to genuine partnership regardless of the risks involved. Through it all, the Emperor found himself experiencing something unprecedented in his long existence, uncertainty about his own role in the future he had worked so long to create. His transformation of chaos had been accomplished through individual will, backed by accumulated power. But building a galactic civilization based on cooperation would require skills he had never needed to develop. I find myself facing a question that has never before arisen, the Emperor admitted as the discussion entered its deepest phases. Every timeline I have observed has required my direct guidance to prevent humanity's destruction. But in this transformed universe, my continued leadership might actually hinder the development of the cooperative civilization we envision. How can beings learn to govern themselves if a figure of absolute authority remains present to solve their problems? The silence that followed his words carried implications that resonated through every corner of the great chamber. Primarchs who had been created to serve as extensions of their father's will found themselves contemplating a future where they might need to surpass, rather than merely implement, his vision. It was Rogel Dawn who first found words adequate to the moment's weight. Then perhaps your greatest gift to humanity would be to prepare us for your eventual withdrawal from direct rule. Not abandonment, but evolution from active guidance to available wisdom. The foundation you have built could support structures you never need to inhabit, a transition planned across generations, Robuta Gilliman added, his organizational mind already working through the implications. Gradual delegation of authority, careful development of institutional frameworks that could function without singular leadership, and the establishment of principles robust enough to guide decision-making in your absence. The Emperor felt something he had not experienced since his earliest days as a simple shaman seeking to guide humanity's first steps. Humility before the magnificent complexity of what his sons had become. They were no longer extensions of his will, but independent beings whose wisdom might indeed exceed his own in areas where cooperation mattered more than command. "Then let us begin the work of building something that has never existed," the Emperor said, rising from his place at the circular table. "Not an empire that depends upon singular authority, but a civilization that grows stronger through the voluntary participation of all who choose to contribute to its flourishing. The Great Crusade will continue, but it will become a great invitation extended to every corner of the galaxy." The decisions reached in that chamber would reshape the course of galactic history in ways that exceeded even the Emperor's transformation of chaos itself. Humanity would expand, not as conquerors, but as architects of a civilization where every species could contribute their unique gifts to something greater than any individual part could achieve. The golden path lay before them, bright with promise and uncertainty in equal measure. And for the first time in his existence, the Emperor of mankind found himself genuinely excited about futures he could not predict, but could help create through the wisdom he had fostered in his remarkable sons. 10 years had passed since the councils that reshaped humanity's destiny, and the galaxy itself seemed to glow with possibilities that had never existed in any previous age. From the highest spire of the imperial palace, the Emperor gazed out upon a Terra transformed beyond recognition. Where once the home world had been scarred by millennia of warfare and environmental devastation, now gardens of impossible beauty stretched toward horizons brightened by clean skies and healthy seas. The transformation was more than merely aesthetic. Across the planet's surface, cities had grown that embodied the architectural principles Perturabo had developed through cooperation with alien builders. Human engineering, combined with Eldar aesthetic sensibilities and crystalline harmonist mathematical precision, to create urban environments that served life rather than merely housing it. Every structure contributed to the whole while maintaining its unique character, creating symphonies in stone and metal that inspired rather than overwhelmed their inhabitants. The reports that reached the Emperor's private chambers spoke of similar transformations occurring across hundreds of worlds as the Great Invitation continued its measured expansion. Compliance had given way to collaboration, conquest had evolved into cooperation, and the Imperium itself was becoming something that defied traditional definition. No longer an empire ruled from Terra, it had grown into a network of allied civilizations bound together by shared purpose rather than enforced unity. From the Vega system came news of the joint research stations, where human psychers worked alongside crystalline harmonist resonance shapers to explore the transformed nature of the warp itself. Magnus the Red's regular reports described discoveries that would have been impossible in any timeline touched by chaos corruption. The Immaterium had become a realm where beneficial concepts could take form, where positive emotions manifested as living energies that strengthened rather than corrupted those who touched them. The psychic children born since our victory show abilities that transcend anything we previously thought possible, Magnus had written in his latest communication. Without the constant threat of demonic possession, their gifts develop naturally toward healing, inspiration, and the bridging of consciousness between species. They represent what humanity can become when fear no longer constrains our potential. Similar reports arrived from every sector where the transformed crusade operated. Rogel Dawn's fortress cities had become centers of learning where beings from dozens of species gathered to share knowledge and culture. Vulcan's forge worlds produced technologies that enhanced life rather than merely serving war. Sanguinius's diplomatic corps had negotiated alliances with civilizations that spanned entire spiral arms, creating trade networks that enriched all participants. Most remarkably, the Primarchs themselves were developing in ways that exceeded even the Emperor's original design. No longer bound by the necessity of constant warfare, Their superhuman abilities were flowering in directions that served creation rather than destruction. Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection had inspired artistic movements that elevated the spirits of entire populations. Korax's gift for moving unseen had become a talent for revealing hidden beauties in overlooked corners of the galaxy. The Emperor felt profound satisfaction as he reviewed these developments. But it was satisfaction tempered by the humility he had discovered during the Great Councils. His sons had indeed surpassed his original vision, becoming not merely extensions of his will, but independent forces for good whose wisdom often exceeded his own. A soft chime announced Malcador's approach, and the ancient sigillite entered the chamber with movements that carried less weight than they had in years past. The transformation of chaos had affected even the oldest human souls, lifting burdens that had pressed upon them for so long they had forgotten what lightness felt like. "The final delegation has arrived from the Outer Rim," Malcador reported, his voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond mere accomplishment of duty. Representatives from the Tau Coalition, the reformed Orc clans, and 3 Eldar craft worlds. Even a Necron overlord has agreed to participate in the Galactic Congress. For the first time in the galaxy's history, every major species will be represented in a forum dedicated to cooperation rather than competition. The Emperor nodded, feeling the weight of what those words represented. The Galactic Congress had been Robut Guilliman's idea, refined through discussions with his brothers and implemented through careful diplomacy that proved cooperation was not only possible, but beneficial for all participants. Representatives from hundreds of species would gather on the neutral world of Harmony Prime to establish frameworks for interspecies collaboration that could function across the vast distances of space. "Have the preparations proceeded according to plan?" the Emperor asked, though his perfect awareness already provided the answer. He found that asking questions allowed others to experience the satisfaction of sharing good news, a small gift he could offer in return for their service. "Beyond our most optimistic projections," Malcador replied, his ancient features brightening with something approaching youthful enthusiasm. "The preliminary agreements have already established protocols for peaceful conflict resolution, resource sharing, and cultural exchange. Several species have expressed interest in joint exploration missions to the galaxy's unexplored regions. The artificial intelligences are contributing computational frameworks that could optimize logistics for endeavors spanning multiple star systems. Through the Great Window, the Emperor could see the lights of Terra's transformed cities, painting patterns that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the planet's renewed life. Each gleam represented billions of human souls who had been freed from the shadow of chaos corruption to explore their highest potential. Artists who no longer needed to fear that inspiration might come from malevolent sources. Scientists whose research could proceed without concern that knowledge might corrupt rather than enlighten. Children who could develop psychic abilities without the terror of possession or madness. "The Primarchs have requested a final council before I begin my withdrawal from direct governance," the Emperor said, the words carrying implications that had been building for years. "They believe themselves ready to assume full responsibility for humanity's future without my active guidance." Malcador's expression showed no surprise, for they had discussed this inevitability since the great transformations began. "And you believe they are correct in this assessment?" The Emperor's smile carried satisfaction so profound it seemed to illuminate the chamber from within. "I believe they have already surpassed the need for my direct involvement. What they seek is not permission to lead, but recognition of leadership they have already assumed. The Great Invitation proceeds under their guidance now. My role has become ceremonial rather than functional. It was true, and the recognition brought joy rather than the loss one might expect from relinquishing power. Across the galaxy, his sons had proven themselves capable of wisdom that transcended their original programming. They made decisions based not on predetermined directives, but on principles they had internalized and made their own. They had become, in the truest sense, independent beings whose choices served good because they had chosen to make them serve good. Reports from the farthest reaches of human expansion spoke of worlds where chaos corruption had once held sway being transformed into gardens of possibility. Demon worlds had become paradises where beings could explore their potential without fear of external corruption. Warp storms that had raged for millennia had calmed into stable passages that connected distant civilizations with reliable safety. Even the Eldar Empire was experiencing a renaissance that would have been impossible under the shadow of Slaaneish's threat. Craft worlds that had wandered the galaxy in desperate flight from extinction had begun settling into permanent locations where they could rebuild their civilization without fear. Their artisans produced works of such beauty that they inspired beneficial emotions across multiple species. Their Farseers could perceive futures bright with promise rather than dark with inevitable doom. The Emperor moved to his private balcony, where the afternoon air carried scents of growing things, rather than the industrial pollution that had characterized Terra for millennia. Below, children played in gardens, where flowers bloomed in patterns that would have driven earlier generations to madness, but now simply inspired wonder and joy. These were the first humans born into a universe where hope was not merely possible but inevitable, where their potential faced no supernatural obstacles to its full development. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation, and he turned to find all 20 of his sons approaching together. They moved not in formal procession, but as the family they had become, their superhuman awareness allowing them to communicate through glances and gestures that conveyed volumes beyond speech. Horus stepped forward as their chosen spokesman, his natural leadership expressing itself through synthesis of his brother's collective wisdom. Father, we have come to express our gratitude for what you have given us, and to request formal recognition of what we believe we have become. The Emperor gestured for them to join him on the balcony, where they could all share the view of Terra's transformation. Speak freely, my sons. The time for formality between us ended when you proved yourselves capable of wisdom I had not taught you. Sanguinius spread his great wings in a gesture that embraced not just the assembly, but the entire vista of the renewed homeworld. We have learned to see beyond the limitations of our original design. Where we were created to serve your vision, we have discovered our own purposes that complement yet transcend your intentions. We believe ourselves ready to guide humanity and its allies toward futures we cannot predict, but can help create through the principles you taught us. Magnus added his perspective with words that carried the harmonics of deep understanding. The galaxy has become something unprecedented, a realm where cooperation serves all participants rather than requiring some to sacrifice for others' benefit. Our role as leaders must evolve to match this transformation. We seek not to rule, but to facilitate, not to command, but to inspire. One by one, each Primarch spoke of their readiness to assume full responsibility for their domains without requiring their father's guidance. They described not conquest, but stewardship, not dominance, but service to the greater good that included all sentient beings, rather than only humanity. The Emperor listened with emotions that transcended simple pride. These beings had become what he had hoped for across millennia of planning, yet they had also become something he had never dared to envision. Truly independent moral agents whose goodness arose from their own choices rather than programmed directives. "You ask for recognition of what you have already achieved," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics of deep satisfaction, mixed with something that could only be described as paternal love made cosmic. "For years now, your decisions have guided the Great Invitation's progress. Your wisdom has shaped policies that affect billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Your moral judgment has created frameworks for cooperation that transcend anything my original plans included." He paused, looking out over the vista of a terror that bloomed with life and possibility, then continued with words that carried the weight of absolute truth. "I created you to be humanity's champions, but you have become something far greater. You have become champions of consciousness itself, guardians of potential wherever it may arise. The galaxy is safer in your care than it ever was in mine." The formal transfer of authority proceeded with ceremonies that lasted for days, as representatives from across the known galaxy gathered to witness the transition that would reshape interstellar civilization. The Emperor remained as a figure of wisdom and counsel, available to provide guidance when requested, but no longer bearing the burden of day-to-day governance. As the festivities continued below, the Emperor found himself alone on his private balcony, as the sun set over a terror transformed beyond recognition. The choice he had made in entering the warp to confront the Chaos Gods had seemed desperate at the time, a final gamble against overwhelming odds. Now he could see it for what it had truly been. Not a desperate measure, but the first step toward something magnificent. The galaxy spread before him, not as a realm to be conquered, but as a canvas upon which beings of goodwill could paint wonders beyond imagination. Chaos had been not destroyed, but redeemed, its power redirected toward beneficial ends. Humanity had found its place, not as rulers of the stars, but as participants in a civilization greater than any single species could achieve. For the first time in his existence, spanning back to the earliest days when shamans had chosen to combine their souls into a singular purpose, the Emperor of mankind allowed himself to feel complete satisfaction with what had been accomplished. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise, guided by beings who had surpassed even his grandest hopes. The war for the soul of reality was not only complete, but had been won in ways that transcended victory itself. Hope was no longer merely possible, but had become the fundamental organizing principle of existence, and in that transformation the Emperor found the vindication of every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt across the long millennia of his existence. The stars themselves seemed to shine brighter as night fell over Terra, as if the universe itself was celebrating the dawn of an age where wonder and joy would reign, where once only darkness and despair had held dominion. And in that cosmic celebration, the Emperor of mankind found peace at last, knowing that the future he had dreamed was not only possible but inevitable.